I flew 12 hours straight from London just to attend my younger sister's wedding in the Hamptons. When I reached the elegant venue doors, my parents blocked my path. "Leave," my mother hissed. "Only real family is allowed in here, and you were not invited." Heartbroken, but composed, I turned around and left. 2 days later, my mother called from an unknown number. "The bill is $50,000, she said. "How will you pay?" I laughed and told her exactly what was going to happen next. She gasped for air. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who deeply underestimated your true worth. My name is Jocelyn. I am 34 years old, and up until that humid summer afternoon, I still foolishly believed that blood meant loyalty. I had built a highly successful career from the ground up, but my family never cared to ask about it. They thought I was just some boring low-level bookkeeper pushing papers in a cramped cubicle somewhere. In reality, I am the founder and chief executive officer of one of the most ruthless forensic accounting and financial fraud investigation firms in New York City. I uncover hidden assets, expose corporate embezzlers, and track down stolen funds for a living. I deal with hard numbers and undeniable facts. But when it came to my own family, I had spent years ignoring the glaring red flags right in front of my face. My sister Kelsey was 29 years old and the undisputed golden child of our household. She was an aspiring social media influencer who cared only about designer labels, follower counts, and projecting an image of unimaginable wealth. Our parents, Helen and Richard, enabled her delusions at every turn. They were obsessed with status, constantly spending beyond their means to maintain the illusion that they belonged to the upper crust of society. For years, they had treated me as an afterthought, an embarrassingly practical daughter who ruined their glamorous aesthetic. The moment I arrived at the luxury beachfront resort in the Hamptons, the salty ocean breeze sticking to my skin, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I had rushed straight from Heathrow Airport, dragging my sleek carry-on bag across the crushed white gravel of the resort driveway. I was exhausted from wrapping up a massive international audit, but I had made the trip because Kelsey was marrying Cameron Prescott. The Prescotts were actual old, a family with generations of immense wealth and a terrifying obsession with their public reputation. My parents viewed this marriage as their ultimate triumph, their golden ticket into high society. As I approached the grand floral archway marking the entrance to the main reception hall, two figures stepped directly into my path. It was my mother and father. Helen wore a heavily beaded gown that looked far too expensive for their actual budget, while Richard stood tall in a rented tuxedo. Their faces twisted into identical expressions of disgust the moment they saw me. "What the hell are you doing here?" Helen demanded, her voice a venomous whisper, meant to evade the ears of the wealthy guests mingling nearby. "I came for my sister's wedding," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly steady, despite the sudden spike in my heart rate. "I received the invitation months ago." "You were sent that by mistake," Richard snapped, taking a step forward to physically block the doorway. "We explicitly agreed that your presence would ruin the aesthetic of the day." "Look at you, Jocelyn. You are dragging a suitcase through a luxury resort. You look like a tired office worker. We cannot have the Prescotts seeing this." Before I could even process the sheer cruelty of his words, the heavy oak doors opened, and Kelsey stepped out. She was draped in a custom silk wedding gown that practically screamed financial ruin. She held a glass of champagne in one hand and her phone in the other, actively recording a video for her followers. When she lowered the phone and spotted me, her carefully contoured smile vanished. "Mom, why is she here?" Kelsey whined, stomping her satin heel. "I told you I wanted a perfect luxury aesthetic for the cameras. She is wearing a boring gray suit. Cameron's parents are inside right now, judging every single detail of our family. If they see her looking like some depressed corporate drone, they will think we are peasants." I looked down at my outfit. What they did not know was that my boring gray suit was a bespoke tailored piece from a master designer in London, costing more than my father earned in a month. But it had no flashy logos, so to my brand-obsessed family, it was trash. "I flew across the Atlantic for you, Kelsey," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. "I am your sister. You are an embarrassment. Kelsey shot back, her eyes narrowing with pure malice. You have always been so dull, so painfully ordinary. Cameron comes from a family of billionaires, Jocelyn. I am marrying into an empire. I cannot have you standing in the background of my photos looking like you just clocked out of a minimum wage shift. Leave. Only real family is allowed in here. Helen waved her hand frantically, signaling for a resort security guard who was standing near the valet station. Officer, she called out with manufactured distress. This woman is trespassing and harassing the bride. Please escort her off the property immediately. The guard approached, looking uncomfortable but dutiful. I did not wait for him to touch me. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream or beg for their love because the cold, analytical part of my brain had finally taken full control. I looked at the three of them standing there in their fake finery, desperate to impress a family of arrogant billionaires. Enjoy your illusion, I said smoothly. I turned on my heel, the wheels of my suitcase crunching against the gravel as I walked away. I pulled out my phone and contacted my private car service, requesting an immediate pickup. The drive from the Hamptons back to Manhattan took over 2 hours, but I spent the entire journey in absolute silence, staring out the tinted windows of the luxury sedan. I was not mourning the loss of my family. I was clinically dissecting every interaction I had ever had with them. My driver pulled up to my building in the heart of the city. My parents firmly believed I lived in a cramped, outdated rental apartment somewhere in the deep suburbs. They believed this because I never corrected them. I preferred peace over their constant demands for money. In reality, the elevator opened directly into my $4 million penthouse, an expansive sanctuary of floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline. I had purchased it entirely in cash 2 years ago, a direct result of my firm recovering millions in a massive corporate embezzlement case. I walked into my pristine kitchen, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and pulled the ornate gold foil wedding invitation from my travel bag. I dropped it straight into the garbage disposal and flipped the switch, listening to the blades shred the heavy cardstock into pulp. As the machine whirred, a specific memory surfaced in my mind, sharply illuminating the reality of my family dynamic. I remembered a Thanksgiving dinner from 5 years ago. I had just secured my very first major corporate client, a milestone that meant everything to me. I had tried to share the news over dinner, but Helen had loudly interrupted me, holding up her wineglass to make a toast to Kelsey hitting 10,000 followers online. When I tried to speak again, Helen had sighed heavily and said, "You are just so relentlessly boring, Jocelyn. Nobody wants to hear about spreadsheets on a holiday. Just stay quiet and let your sister shine. You are meant to be in the background." That was the exact moment I should have walked away, but the desperate human need for parental approval had kept me tethered to their toxicity. Not anymore. I picked up my phone, navigating to my contacts list. I tapped my mother's name and hit block. I did the same for my father and my sister. I removed them from my social media, restricted their access to my email, and effectively erased them from my digital existence. It was a surgical extraction. I felt lighter, instantly breathing in the quiet luxury of my home without the suffocating weight of their expectations dragging me down. The weekend passed in beautiful, unbroken tranquility. I rested, unpacked, prepared for the upcoming work week, and enjoyed the absolute silence of a life devoid of family drama. But predators never let their prey escape that easily. On Tuesday morning, I was sitting at the massive marble desk in my home office, reviewing a complex financial dossier for a new client. The sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating the multiple high-resolution monitors arranged before me. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was an unknown local number. I assumed it was a courier regarding a document delivery, so I answered it with my standard professional greeting. "Jocelyn speaking." There was no greeting on the other end, just the sharp, entitled voice of my mother echoing through the speaker. "The wedding was an absolute triumph," Helen announced, her tone practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. "The Prescotts were completely blown away by our elegance. Cameron and Kelsey are on a flight to the Maldives for a 3-week honeymoon. Everything went exactly according to my vision." I kept my voice perfectly flat. "You called me from an unknown number just to brag about a party you had security throw me out of." "I called because we have business to conclude," Helen snapped, dropping the joyful facade. The final bill for the venue, the imported orchids, the caviar tower, and the open bar has been processed. The total is exactly $50,000. The resort management is pushing for final clearance. Are you going to wire the money today? Or do you need to split it across a few credit cards? I stopped typing. The absolute sheer audacity of her words hung in the quiet air of my office. I leaned back in my leather chair, a cold, sharp laugh escaping my lips. Are you suffering from clinical delusion? I asked calmly. Why on earth would I pay $50,000 for a wedding I was forcibly removed from? Because you are the older sister! Helen shrieked, her voice pitching upward in sudden fury. You have a responsibility to this family, to help us maintain our status. We spent everything we had on the deposit and the photographer. We had to show the Prescotts that we are their equals. You are going to pay this bill because that is your duty. I am not paying a single dime, I replied, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the room. Do not ever call me again. I was about to end the call when Helen let out a dark, triumphant chuckle. It was the sound of a woman who thought she had perfectly cornered her victim. You do not have a choice, Jocelyn, she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. The contract with the Hamptons resort is already legally binding. It lists you as the primary financial guarantor. Your full name, your date of birth, and your social security number are printed right there on the dotted line. The resort has your information on file for the final collection. If you do not pay them by Friday, they will send the debt to collections and file a lawsuit against you. Have fun explaining a $50,000 default to your little accounting boss. Good luck with your credit score. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone to my desk. A normal person would have panicked. A normal person would have broken down in tears, terrified of the legal threats and the massive financial burdens suddenly chained to their name. But I was not a normal person. I was a licensed fraud examiner. I spent my days tracking down financial criminals who thought they were smarter than the system. My parents had not just insulted me. They had not just kicked me out of a party. They had actively committed felony identity theft across state lines. They had taken my sensitive financial data and used it to secure a luxury service under false pretenses. I did not cry. I did not scream. I felt a terrifying absolute calm wash over my entire body. I cracked my knuckles, my eyes locked on the glowing screens in front of me. The predators had just confidently handed the ultimate hunter their exact coordinates. They thought they were dealing with a timid, subservient daughter. They were about to find out exactly what I did for a living. The demolition of their perfectly curated fake upper-class lives was about to begin. I did not waste a single second staring blankly at the wall. My fingers hovered over my mechanical keyboard, and the rhythmic clacking filled the quiet expanse of my penthouse. My mother genuinely believed I was a naive, low-level clerk who would cower at the mere threat of collection agencies. She had no idea that tracing illicit financial trails, dismantling corporate fraud, and bringing white-collar criminals to their knees was my literal profession. I spent my days dissecting offshore accounts and exposing embezzlement rings for massive corporations. Tracking down a forged wedding contract was going to be exceptionally easy. I opened a secure encrypted browser and bypassed the general customer service phone numbers for the luxury Hamptons resort. Using public corporate registries, I located the direct office line for the resort group's regional director of finance. When I dialed the number, a man answered with a crisp, professional tone. I introduced myself not as an angry family member, but utilizing my formal corporate title. I informed him that my firm was currently conducting an internal audit regarding a disputed charge of $50,000 tied to an event hosted at his property over the weekend. I clearly stated that my legal name and social security number had been attached to a binding financial agreement without my presence, authorization, or consent. The finance director immediately understood the legal gravity of the situation. Resorts of that caliber absolutely despise the threat of federal credit fraud taking place on their watch. Within 5 minutes, my secure email inbox chimed with an incoming message. It contained a highly detailed 40-page scanned PDF of the entire wedding contract. I opened the file on my largest monitor, leaning forward to scrutinize the details. The invoice was an absolute masterpiece of financial delusion. My parents had spared no expense in their desperate attempt to impress the Prescott family. I saw line items for thousands of imported white orchids, beluga caviar stations, a premium vintage champagne tower, and custom silk drapery for the dining pavilion. But I skipped past the ridiculous expenses and scrolled directly to the final signature page. There it was. Under the bold heading labeled Primary Financial Guarantor, someone had printed my full legal name. Just below that, my actual 9-digit social security number was written out with perfect accuracy, and at the bottom of the page sat the signature. It was a clumsy, overly looped cursive scrawl that leaned heavily to the right. It looked absolutely nothing like my sharp, angular signature. I recognized that pretentious, looping handwriting instantly. It belonged to my mother, Helen. She had forged my name on a binding legal document to fund her social climbing fantasies. I sat back in my leather chair, the cool air conditioning of my office, contrasting with the burning heat of realization spreading through my chest. How did she get my social security number? Our parents did not simply memorize our federal identification numbers. They needed a physical document. A memory from exactly 3 months ago sharply clicked into place. My father Richard had called me on a Tuesday evening, sounding uncharacteristically warm and paternal. He told me that his health was not what it used to be, and that he was updating his comprehensive life insurance policies. He claimed he wanted to make sure both of his daughters were listed as contingent beneficiaries, so we would be financially secure if anything ever happened to him. He asked me to send over a copy of my most recent tax return, supposedly, because his insurance broker needed to verify my legal address and identification details to establish the trust. I had been foolish enough to believe him. I had sent that document thinking it was a rare, genuine moment of parental responsibility. Instead, Richard had taken my tax return, marched straight to the resort planners, and handed my social security number over to my mother so she could fraudulently underwrite a $50,000 luxury wedding. They had weaponized my basic trust to steal my identity. Before I could even begin drafting a formal report to the federal authorities, my phone vibrated on the desk. The caller ID displayed an international routing number. I answered the call, putting it on speakerphone so I could continue saving copies of the forged contract to my encrypted server. "Jocelyn, you have to fix this right now." It was Kelsey. Her voice was shrill, frantic, and entirely devoid of her usual curated influencer persona. She was supposed to be on a luxury flight to the Maldives with Cameron, but the background noise sounded like the chaotic, echoing terminal of an airport first-class lounge. "Fix what, Kelsey?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Do not play dumb with me," she snapped, her breathing ragged and panicked. "The resort management just emailed me and copied Cameron. They said the final payment method on file was rejected because you are disputing the charges. Cameron is furious. His parents are going to find out. If Mr. and Mrs. Prescott discover that my family is defaulting on a $50,000 bill, they will absolutely destroy us. They are billionaires, Jocelyn. They do not tolerate public humiliation." I continued typing a command into my terminal window, listening to the sheer entitlement radiating from her voice. "And why is this my problem, Kelsey? I was physically escorted off the property by security at your explicit request." "Because you are my older sister," Kelsey shrieked, dropping the angry act and instantly pivoting to a fake, tearful victim routine. "You are supposed to protect me. I am finally getting the life I deserve. Cameron is perfect. His family is royalty. If they think we are a bunch of broke frauds, they will force him to cancel the honeymoon. They might even make him annul the marriage. You have a good corporate job. You can easily get a loan to cover this. Please, Jocelyn, you have to take the hit for me. You cannot let them ruin my life over a stupid bill." I stopped typing and leaned into the microphone. "Listen to me very carefully, Kelsey. I am not paying a single dime for a party I was thrown out of. Your husband and his arrogant parents are about to learn exactly who they married into. I am not getting a loan. I am calling the FBI." I tapped the screen and disconnected the call, immediately blocking the international number. I did not care if she stood in that airport lounge screaming until her lungs gave out. The days of me acting as a shield for her selfish vanity were permanently over. But my analytical instincts were screaming that the situation was far worse than a single forged resort contract. Fraudsters who successfully execute identity theft rarely stop at just one transaction. If Richard and Helen were bold enough to forge my signature for a $50,000 venue, they had likely used my information elsewhere. I opened a new browser window and bypassed the standard consumer credit checking websites. Using my professional access credentials, I logged directly into the comprehensive federal databases for Equifax and Experian. I pulled my raw, unfiltered credit history for the past 90 days. The progress bar spun for a few seconds before the dense spreadsheet loaded onto my screen. The overall credit score at the top of the page immediately caught my attention. It had plummeted by nearly 100 points. I scrolled down past my legitimate mortgage and standard auto payments, down to the section listing recent inquiries and newly opened trade lines. The numbers glowing on the monitor made the air leave my lungs. There was not just one fraudulent account, there were three. Exactly 45 days ago, a platinum tier credit card from a major national bank had been opened using my social security number and an email address I did not recognize. The current balance on that card was maxed out at $40,000. A quick check of the vendor codes showed the money had been spent on first-class international airline tickets and luxury resort bookings. A week after that, a second line of credit had been established with an exclusive boutique jewelry retailer in Manhattan. That account was carrying a balance of $35,000. The exact price of a custom diamond engagement ring and matching platinum wedding bands. Finally, there was a third account opened with a high-end bridal design house. That card was maxed out at $25,000. The exact cost of the custom silk wedding gown Kelsey had flaunted while ordering security to remove me from her presence. I sat in absolute silence doing the mental math. 40,000, 35,000, 25,000, plus the 50,000 owed to the Hamptons resort. My parents had stolen my identity to rack up $150,000 in fraudulent debt. They had financed Kelsey's entire fake billionaire lifestyle using my pristine credit history as their personal piggy bank. Every single thing Kelsey had shown off to the Prescott family, the rings, the dress, the flights, the caviar, was bought with stolen money. They had chained a massive financial anchor to my name, fully expecting me to quietly absorb the ruin to protect their precious social climbing ambitions. They thought they had trapped me. They thought they could bury me in debt to buy their way into high society. Instead, they had just confidently handed a professional fraud investigator the exact federal ammunition needed to send all of them to prison. I printed the credit reports, placing the pages into a neat, crisp stack next to the forged contract. My shock completely evaporated, leaving behind an icy, relentless focus. The game was no longer about family resentment. It was about federal prosecution. How does a forensic accountant get hacked by her own parents? That question burned in my mind as I stared at the 9 digits of my social security number printed on the fraudulent venue contract. I protect my personal data with military-grade encryption. I shred my physical mail. I freeze my credit reports annually. A stranger could never pierce my security measures. But a parent does not have to hack a firewall. They just have to exploit your lifelong desperation for their love. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together. 3 months ago, the weather in New York had just begun to warm up. I was sitting right here at this very desk when my father called. Richard rarely called me unless he needed technical help with his computer or an excuse to complain about taxes. But that evening his voice was thick with manufactured exhaustion. He sounded like an aging man finally recognizing his own mortality. He told me he had recently met with a high-end wealth manager to set up a comprehensive, irrevocable life insurance trust. He claimed he wanted to guarantee that both of his daughters would be financially shielded if his health ever suddenly failed. He said he needed to verify my exact residential history and identification details to list me as a primary beneficiary. He asked me to send over my most recent tax return and a W-2 form. I am a professional investigator. I should have asked for the name of his wealth manager. I should have demanded to speak with his attorney directly. But in that brief, vulnerable moment, I was just a daughter who wanted to believe her father actually cared about her future. I wanted to believe I was finally being treated as a valued member of the family. So I generated a secure link and transmitted the documents. I did not use my tax return to secure my future. He used it to fund his favorite child's luxury wedding. He took my financial security and traded it for a caviar tower and a champagne fountain. The level of premeditated malice was staggering. He had looked at my financial independence not with pride, but as an untapped line of credit he was entitled to exploit. There was no greeting, no apology for the humiliation I suffered at the Hamptons, just the piercing sound of her weaponized crying. It was the exact same fake hysterical weeping she used when we were children to avoid getting grounded. Fix what exactly, I asked, keeping my tone entirely devoid of emotion. The resort manager just emailed, Cameron's father. Kelsey wailed her breath, hitching in a performance worthy of an award. They told him the primary guarantor is disputing the final $50,000 wedding bill. Jocelyn, do you have any idea what you are doing to me right now? You are literally ruining my life over petty jealousy. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool marble of my desk. Petty jealousy. Kelsey, you allowed Mom and Dad to forge my signature on a legally binding contract. You used my social security number to pay for a party you ordered security to throw me out of. I did not forge anything! Kelsey snapped, her tears vanishing instantly, revealing the venom underneath. Mom handled the logistics. I was the bride. I was entirely focused on curating my aesthetic. But that does not matter now. What matters is that Mr. Prescott is furious. He just gave Cameron and me a secondary black card tied to the Prescott Family Trust. We are supposed to be living a flawless luxury lifestyle. If his lawyers find out my family is defaulting on a venue bill, he will cut off our access to the accounts. He will realize we do not have actual liquid wealth. You have to take responsibility for this and save me. Take responsibility. I repeated, letting the sheer absurdity of her demand sink in. You want me to take responsibility for your fraudulent spending so you can keep pretending to be a billionaire on social media. You are my older sister, Kelsey shrieked. You owe me this. You have a massive corporate salary and no life. You sit in your apartment crunching numbers all day. $50,000 is nothing to you. If you do not wire that money to the resort by tomorrow, I swear to God, I will call the partners at your accounting firm. I will tell them you are a deadbeat who defaults on major contracts. I will ruin your professional reputation, Jocelyn. I will make sure you lose your job. A terrifying silence descended upon my home office. Kelsey thought her threat was a masterstroke. She genuinely believed she held the power in this dynamic because our parents had always allowed her to dictate the rules. She had absolutely no concept of the fire she was playing with. Kelsey, I said, my voice dropping to a glacial whisper that made her immediately stop breathing on the other end of the line. You do not seem to comprehend the reality of your situation. You think this is a family disagreement about a party bill. It is not. You and our parents committed severe identity theft. You committed wire fraud across state lines. You conspired to defraud a luxury hospitality group using stolen federal identification numbers. You are bluffing, she stammered, but the underlying panic in her voice was undeniable. Mom said you would just pay it to avoid the embarrassment. Mom is an idiot, I replied sharply. And you are a co-conspirator. You just admitted on a recorded line that you knew Mom forged my financial documents to secure your wedding venue. I am not wiring you a single cent. I am not calling the resort. I am calling the FBI. Jocelyn, wait, you cannot. Kelsey shrieked, her voice pitching into genuine unfiltered terror. I tapped the red button on my screen, instantly severing the connection. I tossed the phone onto the desk and picked up my pen. The initial phase of gathering evidence was complete. Now it was time to systematically dismantle their entire operation. The game was no longer about family resentment. It was about federal prosecution. I pulled my keyboard closer and launched my specialized auditing software. Standard consumers wait days for credit dispute resolutions or rely on automated fraud alerts. I do not. I have direct portal access to the major credit bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. I bypassed the consumer-facing dashboards and pulled my raw comprehensive credit profile. The data populated on my secondary monitor in dense rows of financial history. I have maintained a flawless credit score for over a decade. It is a strict requirement for my professional licensing and my federal security clearances. Seeing the number at the top of the report made my blood run ice cold. My perfect score had been completely decimated, plunging by over 150 points in less than 90 days. I scrolled past my legitimate mortgage payments and standard utilities straight to the section detailing newly opened trade lines and recent hard inquiries. The $50,000 Hamptons resort contract was just the beginning. It was merely the loudest alarm in a house already engulfed in flames. My parents had not just borrowed my identity for a venue deposit, they had essentially cloned my financial existence. There was a platinum rewards card, issued by a major national bank, opened exactly 45 days ago. The current balance sat at $42,000. I pulled the merchant codes mapping out the spending spree. The charges were a geographic roadmap of Kelsey's supposed luxury lifestyle. I saw first-class flights to the Maldives booked through Emirates. I saw non-refundable deposits for overwater bungalows at a five-star island resort. I saw thousands of dollars spent at designer luggage boutiques in Soho. They had literally financed a fake billionaire honeymoon on my stolen identity. I moved to the next row on the spreadsheet. A store-specific credit account opened at one of the most exclusive jewelers on Fifth Avenue. The balance was maxed out at exactly $35,000. My mind immediately flashed to a specific Instagram reel Kelsey had posted weeks ago. She had been waving her left hand in front of the camera, squealing about how Cameron had surprised her with a custom platinum wedding band encrusted with flawless diamonds. She had bragged endlessly about her wealthy future husband spoiling her. Her followers had eaten it up, praising her perfect romance. In reality, my stolen social security number had purchased those diamonds. Cameron had not paid a single dime for his own wife's wedding band. The third account was a high-limit line of credit, approved through a premier bridal design house in Manhattan. $23,000 gone. I remembered the silk and lace monstrosity Kelsey had been wearing when she ordered security to drag me off the resort property. She had stood there mocking my bespoke suit, calling me a corporate drone, all while wearing a dress financed entirely by my stolen identity. She had literally worn my money while calling me a peasant. I opened a new spreadsheet and began inputting the balances. $42,000 for the honeymoon and luggage, $35,000 for the diamonds, $23,000 for the dress. Added to the $50,000 resort bill currently heading to collections, the total hovered at a staggering $150,000. My parents had chained a massive financial anchor to my name to buy their golden child a fake billionaire aesthetic. They had deliberately sacrificed my financial future so Kelsey could pretend she belonged to the elite. The psychology behind their actions was almost as insulting as the theft itself. They honestly thought they could get away with this. They assumed I would be too intimidated by the sheer volume of the debt to fight back. They calculated that I would quietly absorb the ruin rather than risk a public family scandal. They believed my silence over the years was a sign of weakness. They mistook my desire for peace as an inability to wage war. I could easily pay off $150,000. I could wire the money from my personal accounts right now and barely notice the deduction. But doing so would validate their delusion. It would teach them that my boundaries were meaningless. My parents had operated under the assumption that because they gave me life, they were entitled to harvest my success. They thought they owned me. I needed to shatter that illusion so completely that they would never dare look in my direction again. I cross-referenced the mailing addresses used to open these fraudulent accounts. My parents had not even tried to be sophisticated. They routed all the physical billing statements to a post office box in their own zip code. The email address tied to the accounts was a generic webmail address incorporating my mother's maiden name. It was incredibly sloppy. They were amateurs playing a high-stakes federal game and leaving their fingerprints all over the crime scene. I did not cancel the cards immediately. Canceling them would simply close the accounts and trigger standard bank fraud protocols, which take months and often end in quiet settlements. I did not want a quiet settlement. I needed federal prosecution. I needed absolute destruction of their fraudulent network. I began exporting the raw data, compiling every merchant code timestamp and IP address log attached to the applications. I built a bulletproof evidence file ready to be handed directly to the authorities. I packed the printed credit reports, the forged resort contract, and the IP tracking data into a sleek black leather portfolio. I was not going to send an email or make an angry phone call. Financial predators rely on distance and denial to maintain their composure. I was going to strip that distance away entirely. I walked to the private elevator of my penthouse, hitting the button for the underground garage. My parents were currently renting a lavish estate in the suburbs, a property they used to project wealth while rubbing shoulders with the local country club elite. They were probably sitting in their rented living room right now, sipping expensive wine and patting themselves on the back for pulling off the perfect scam. As I stepped into my car, my phone lit up again. It was a text message from Richard. My father had the audacity to message me while sitting on a stolen mountain of my money. The message read, "Jocelyn, your mother is very upset. Just pay the resort bill and we can put all this ugliness behind us. Do the right thing for your family." I stared at the message, feeling a predatory smile stretch across my face. I took a screenshot of his text and added it to my growing federal evidence file. They wanted me to do the right thing for the family. I was about to do exactly that by ensuring they faced every single consequence the United States justice system had to offer. I placed the leather portfolio on the passenger seat and started the engine. It was time to pay my dear parents a personal visit. The drive to the Connecticut suburbs took exactly 47 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I drove in complete silence, letting the cold, analytical side of my brain map out the impending confrontation. I navigated the winding tree-lined roads of the affluent neighborhood where my parents were currently renting a massive Tudor-style estate. The property was a carefully constructed illusion. They leased the house, they leased the luxury cars in the driveway, and now I knew they were leasing their entire existence on my stolen credit. I bypassed the doorbell and punched the security code into the electronic lock. Richard had demanded I set up their smart home security system last year, complaining that technology was too frustrating for him. He had unknowingly given me permanent, unfiltered access to his sanctuary. The heavy oak door swung open with a soft click, and I stepped into the grand marble foyer. I marched straight into the formal living room. The scene before me was almost comical in its unearned arrogance. Richard was lounging in a velvet wingback chair, slowly swirling a glass of amber scotch. Helen was draped elegantly across the matching sofa, aggressively tapping on her tablet, likely monitoring the social media engagement on Kelsey's fake honeymoon posts. They looked relaxed. They looked completely at peace with the fact that they had financially slaughtered their eldest daughter to fund a lie. They looked up in surprise as I crossed the threshold. Richard immediately began adjusting his posture, preparing to put on his stern, patriarchal face. He opened his mouth, ready to deliver a lecture about family loyalty and ungrateful children. I did not give him the chance to speak a single word. I raised the thick, heavy stack of printed Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion reports high in the air and slammed them down onto the glass coffee table. The impact sounded like a gunshot echoing through the vaulted ceiling. The pages slid across the glass, displaying rows of red highlighted numbers and maximum credit limits. "What on earth is wrong with you?" Helen gasped, clutching the collar of her cashmere sweater. "Have you completely lost your mind, barging into our home like a lunatic?" I pointed a steady, unwavering finger at the stack of papers. $150,000. That is the exact amount of federal wire fraud and identity theft you two committed in the last 90 days. I know about the first-class flights to the Maldives. I know about the Fifth Avenue diamonds. I know about the custom silk gown. You stole my social security number to finance a fake billionaire lifestyle for your favorite child. I expected them to panic. I expected a frantic denial or a clumsy attempt to shift the blame onto some anonymous hacker. I did not expect the sheer breathtaking indignation that immediately twisted Richard's face. He slammed his scotch glass down onto the side table, rattling the crystal. He stood up, towering over me, his face flushing a dark, dangerous red. "I am your father," Richard roared, his voice vibrating with absolute, unfiltered entitlement. "I gave you life. I raised you. I put a roof over your head and fed you for 18 years. So what if I used your name to borrow a little bit of money? It is just a loan. Families help each other." "A little bit of money," I repeated, staring at his furious face. You maxed out 3 premium credit cards and defaulted on a $50,000 resort contract. We are merging with the Prescott family. Richard continued loudly, stepping closer to intimidate me. Do you have any idea the level of wealth and status they possess? We have to maintain our image. We have to keep up appearances so they do not look down on us. You are the older sister. You have a massive corporate salary and pristine credit. It is your fundamental duty to carry this burden for your family. Duty. He called it a duty. He looked me dead in the eye and called federal identity theft a duty. Helen chimed in, her voice dripping with toxic, manipulative sweetness. Your father is right, Jocelyn. You are being completely unreasonable and entirely too dramatic. Kelsey is finally getting the life she deserves. You should be happy to help her secure her future. We knew you had perfect credit, and we knew you were too selfish to voluntarily give us the money. We did what we had to do as parents to ensure our youngest daughter was taken care of. You can easily pay off those cards over the next few years. It is a small sacrifice for your sister's happiness. A small sacrifice. She called $150,000 of fraudulent debt a small sacrifice. The staggering audacity paralyzed me for exactly 1 second. They were not sorry. They were not ashamed. They were entirely convinced that my existence was solely meant to subsidize their vanity. You really think this is a family dispute? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You think I am just going to set up a payment plan and quietly absorb the cost of your felonies so you can impress a bunch of arrogant billionaires? You did not borrow money, Richard. You committed a string of federal crimes. Richard scoffed, waving a dismissive hand as if batting away an annoying insect. Oh, stop throwing around dramatic legal terms. Nobody is going to prison over a few credit cards. You are my daughter. The banks are not going to care once you start making the minimum payments. You are just throwing a tantrum because you have always been jealous of Kelsey. You have always resented the fact that she is beautiful and charismatic and marrying into a prominent family. You are trying to sabotage her out of pure spite. Spite. He thought this was about spite. My entire life had been a series of dismissals. I was the child they ignored while they poured every resource into Kelsey. But this was not about past neglect anymore. This was a clinical financial execution. I stepped closer to Richard, refusing to back down, refusing to let his physical intimidation work on me. I am a forensic accountant, Richard. I track down sophisticated corporate embezzlement rings for a living. You routed the billing statements to your own post office box. You used Mom's maiden name for the digital correspondence. You used the exact same IP address from this rented house to submit every single fraudulent application. You handed me a perfectly packaged federal case. Helen stood up, smoothing her expensive trousers, panic finally beginning to crack her perfect facade. Jocelyn, stop this nonsense right now. You are upsetting your father. We will transfer the resort bill to your name properly, and you will pay it. As for the credit cards, we will figure something out. We will pay you back eventually when Cameron and Kelsey are settled and can dip into the Prescott Trust. Until then, you need to be a supportive sister. If you ruin her marriage over this, I will never forgive you. I do not want your forgiveness, Helen. I want my identity back. And since you clearly have no intention of clearing this debt immediately, I will have the authorities clear it for me. I am not here to negotiate a payment plan. I came here to look you both in the eye and watch you realize that your actions have permanent, devastating consequences. Richard took a threatening step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. You will do no such thing, he growled, his eyes blazing with fury. You will sit down, you will log into your little banking portals, and you will authorize the payments. You belong to this family and you will do exactly what I tell you to do. I did not flinch as Richard took that threatening step forward. His face was a mask of rage, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of genuine panic. He knew he had lost control of the narrative. Before I could tell him exactly where to shove his ridiculous demands, the sharp chime of the front gate intercom echoed through the vaulted living room. Helen gasped, her hand flying to her chest. She grabbed her tablet and tapped the security camera feed. Her carefully manicured face drained of all remaining color. It is Arthur and Eleanor, she hissed, her voice a frantic whisper. The Prescotts are here. They must have driven over the moment Cameron got Kelsey's phone call. Richard instantly dropped his clenched fists. His entire posture shifted from an enraged tyrant to a subservient host. He frantically smoothed the front of his shirt and gestured wildly for me to hide the stacks of printed credit reports. "Put those away," Richard demanded through gritted teeth. "Do not say a single word. You will not humiliate us in front of them." I did not move a single inch. I left the devastating evidence of their federal crimes sitting right in the center of the glass coffee table. The heavy oak front door opened, and Arthur and Eleanor Prescott stepped into the foyer. They were the very definition of arrogant new money. Arthur wore a bespoke suit that cost more than a reliable car, and his wrist was weighed down by a gold watch the size of a hockey puck. Eleanor carried a designer handbag covered in ostentatious logos, looking around the rented property with an expression of polite disdain. They exuded an aura of people who believed their bank accounts made them entirely untouchable. Helen did not waste a single second. The moment Eleanor stepped into the living room, my mother completely transformed. Her face crumbled into a mask of pure manufactured tragedy. She let out a dramatic sob and rushed toward the wealthy matriarch, pressing a trembling hand to her eyes. "Eleanor, thank goodness you are here," Helen cried, her voice vibrating with fake sorrow. "We are dealing with an absolute nightmare. It is Jocelyn." Eleanor frowned, taking a cautious step back from my mother's theatrics. "Cameron called us from the Maldives. He said there was some sort of issue with the final venue billing. He said your daughter is causing a disturbance." "It is much worse than a disturbance," Helen wept, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "Jocelyn is having a complete mental breakdown. She has always been insanely jealous of Kelsey. She has always resented how beautiful and successful her sister is. And now that Kelsey has married into your wonderful family, Jocelyn has lost her mind. She is trying to sabotage the wedding payments out of pure spite. She is threatening to cancel the credit accounts just to humiliate us and ruin the honeymoon." I stood there listening to my own mother spin a tale of profound delusion. She was casually framing her own felony identity theft as my psychological breakdown. She was serving me up on a silver platter to protect her fraudulent billionaire aesthetic. Richard immediately chimed in, nodding solemnly. "We are so embarrassed, Arthur. We tried to give Jocelyn a good life, but she has always harbored this toxic resentment. She is trying to extort us. We are doing everything we can to contain her negative energy so it does not infect Kelsey and Cameron." Arthur Prescott did not look sympathetic. He looked deeply irritated. He stepped past Richard and walked directly up to me. He did not introduce himself. He did not offer a greeting. He simply looked me up and down, analyzing my tailored suit and unimpressed posture as if I were a stain on the carpet. "I do not care about your family drama," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble of pure condescension. "I care about my family name. My son is currently on his honeymoon fielding phone calls from angry resort managers. The Prescott name does not bounce checks. The Prescott name does not default on contracts. You are making my son look like a fool in front of his peers." "Mr. Prescott," I said, keeping my tone completely level and devoid of emotion, "you are being lied to. This is not a family dispute. My parents committed identity theft. They forged my signature and used my social security number to open $150,000 in fraudulent credit accounts to pay for that wedding. They stole my financial identity." Arthur let out a harsh, barking laugh. He did not even glance at the stack of credit reports on the table. He looked at me with absolute disgust. "Identity theft," he scoffed. "Do not play games with me, little girl. I know exactly what this is. I have dealt with bitter relatives trying to cash in on my family's wealth for decades. You see your sister marrying a Prescott and suddenly you want a piece of the pie. You are throwing a tantrum over a few credit bills, hoping I will step in and write a check just to make the noise stop." He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a sleek leather checkbook and a heavy gold pen. He flipped the book open, holding it in one hand while uncapping the pen. "Everyone has a price," Arthur said, his eyes locking onto mine with predatory arrogance. "So let us skip the emotional theatrics and the fake legal threats. How much money do you need to shut up and handle your own debt? Give me a number. I will write the check right now to cover whatever petty bills you are crying about. But once you take this money, you are going to disappear. You will never contact Cameron or Kelsey again. You will never embarrass my family again." I stared at the checkbook. He genuinely thought he could purchase my silence. He thought his wealth was a universal eraser for federal crimes. I am not taking your money, I said, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. And I am not going anywhere. Arthur snapped the checkbook shut, his face hardening into a mask of pure malice. You are making a massive mistake, he warned, pointing the gold pen directly at my face. You think you are smart. You think you have some sort of leverage. You have absolutely nothing. I employ a team of the most ruthless corporate lawyers in this state. If you do not resolve this little credit dispute quietly and immediately, I will unleash them on you. I will have them dig into your life, your finances, and your career. I will make sure your firm fires you. I will drag your name through the mud until you cannot get a job anywhere in this country. You will handle your own debt, or I will personally ensure you are financially ruined. The Prescott family does not tolerate peasants who make us look bad. I looked at Arthur Prescott. I looked at his horrified wife. I looked at my parents, who were standing in the background nodding in frantic agreement with the billionaire threatening their own flesh and blood. They were all standing in a circle of mutual delusion. They believed money and intimidation were the only forces that governed the world. They had no idea that their threats meant absolutely nothing to me. They had no idea that they were standing in a room overflowing with documented wire fraud. Arthur Prescott had just threatened to destroy my career to protect a marriage built entirely on stolen funds. He had just officially involved himself in a massive federal conspiracy, and I was going to let him dig his own grave. I did not reach for the checkbook. I did not blink. I let his threat hang in the sterile air of the rented living room. Arthur Prescott expected me to cower. He expected me to snatch the money and run exactly like the desperate peasant he assumed I was. Instead, I stood completely still, matching his cold stare with an absolute void of emotion. Keep your money, Arthur, I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence. You are going to need every single cent to salvage your own corporate empire. He froze. The heavy gold pen hovered millimeters above the checkbook. A muscle in his jaw twitched. For a man accustomed to blind obedience, sheer defiance was an alien concept. He narrowed his eyes clearly, trying to calculate if I was bluffing. I was not bluffing. I was holding the detonator. You think this is about a $50,000 catering bill? I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. You think my parents just borrowed my name to book a ballroom? You are remarkably misinformed for a man who claims to command a team of ruthless corporate lawyers. The resort contract is just the surface-level debris. The real financial crater is the $100,000 in premium credit card debt your precious daughter-in-law just racked up using my stolen Social Security number. Eleanor gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. Richard and Helen exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated panic. They knew about the cards. They just never expected me to bring them up in front of their billionaire lifeline. That is a lie, Helen shrieked, stepping forward. Arthur, do not listen to her. She is making this up to extort you. I ignored my mother completely. My eyes remained locked on Arthur. His arrogant sneer had begun to slip, replaced by the cold calculation of a predator, realizing he had walked into a trap. But here is the part that should truly terrify you, Arthur, I said, lowering my voice to a lethal calm. My pristine credit score was enough to get the accounts approved, but it was not enough to secure the massive limits Kelsey needed to fund her fake billionaire aesthetic. She needed collateral. She needed a guarantor with deep institutional wealth to bypass the bank's secondary underwriting protocols. And your son Cameron was desperate enough to give it to her. Arthur's face drained of color. The deep tan he had acquired on some private island seemed to vanish instantly. What are you talking about? He demanded. His voice had lost its rumbling authority. It was sharp now, edged with genuine fear. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a secondary stack of documents. These were not just credit reports. These were the underlying asset verification forms tied to the fraudulent accounts. I had bypassed the standard bureau filters and pulled the hard data from the underwriter's desk. I tossed the clipped pages onto the glass table right next to his open checkbook. The $100,000 in credit was quietly collateralized by 5% of the Prescott Company stock. Cameron quietly transferred those voting shares to Kelsey last month. She used them to back the credit lines she opened in my name. She tied your family's corporate equity directly to a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy. The entire living room went completely dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the central air conditioning. The revelation hit the room like a physical shockwave. Arthur Prescott slowly lowered his pen. He did not look at my parents. He did not look at his wife. He stared at the documents on the glass table as if they were a live explosive. He was a billionaire CEO. He understood the lethal implications of what I had just said instantly. If federal investigators uncovered the identity theft, they would trace the collateral. They would freeze the associated assets. 5% of the Prescott family trust would be seized as evidence in a federal racketeering case. No, Eleanor whimpered, grabbing her husband's arm. Arthur, tell me she is lying. Cameron would never do that. Cameron knows the rules of the trust. Arthur ignored her. He slowly picked up the underwriter reports. His eyes scanned the dense financial coding. He saw his son's digital signature. He saw the exact routing numbers for the Prescott family holding accounts. The paper trail was immaculate. The paper trail was undeniable. Your son handed over institutional voting shares to a woman he had known for barely a year. I said my words striking like hammer blows. He bypassed your legal team to do it. And Kelsey immediately weaponized those shares to commit a federal felony against her own sister. Your family name is not just associated with a bounced check, Arthur. Your family name is the foundational collateral for a criminal enterprise. Richard tried to intervene, his voice trembling with sheer terror. Arthur, please, you have to understand. We had absolutely no idea about the stock transfer. We just thought Cameron was being generous. Kelsey is a good girl. She just got carried away with the wedding planning. We can fix this. Shut your mouth, Arthur roared. The sound was deafening. It was not the calculated anger of a businessman negotiating a deal. It was the primal fury of a patriarch realizing his legacy had been hijacked by amateurs. He turned his blazing eyes on my father. You raised a parasite. You bred a financial predator, and you let her sink her teeth into my son. He turned back to me, his chest heaving. How did you get these documents? These are restricted internal underwriting files. I told you exactly who I am, I replied smoothly. I dismantle corporate fraud for a living. I follow the money. I found this in less than 48 hours. Imagine what the FBI forensic teams will find when I hand them this portfolio tomorrow morning. Imagine the absolute media circus when the federal authorities raid the Prescott corporate headquarters to seize the compromised shares. Arthur swallowed hard. The absolute power he had wielded just 5 minutes ago was gone, entirely evaporated by the cold, hard facts resting on the coffee table. He looked at me, not as a peasant to be swatted away, but as a highly dangerous adversary who held the fate of his company in her hands. What do you want? Arthur asked. His voice was a tight, strained rasp. You did not come here just to gloat. You compiled this dossier for a reason. Name your terms. I am not selling my silence, I stated flatly. I do not want your money. I want my financial identity completely restored, and I want it done by tomorrow afternoon. You are going to force Cameron to liquidate whatever personal assets he has to pay off every single cent of that fraudulent debt. You are going to force Kelsey to close those accounts and issue a formal notarized statement admitting to the identity theft. And what about them? Arthur asked, gesturing sharply toward my parents, who were currently cowering by the sofa. They are going to face the consequences of their actions. I said, my gaze locking onto Richard's terrified face. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of high society. Now they get to pay the entry fee. I turned my back on the stunned silence of that rented living room and walked out the front door. The morning air was crisp, and I breathed it in deeply, feeling a profound sense of absolute clarity. The emotional, messy part was over. From this moment forward, it was purely a numbers game, and nobody played the numbers better than I did. I caught a flight back to New York that same evening. I did not sleep on the plane. I spent the entire journey outlining the exact financial parameters of the strike. By 8 o'clock the next morning, I was standing in the center of my firm's primary conference room on the 42nd floor, overlooking the Manhattan skyline. We called it the War Room. The walls were covered in digital displays and whiteboards. There was no room for tears here. There was no space for family sentiment or childhood nostalgia. There was only raw data and the cold, undeniable truth of federal wire fraud. I assembled a team of my top 3 forensic auditors. Marcus was our digital trace expert. Sarah specialized in shell company unmasking. David was a former IRS investigator who could find a hidden dime in a burning building. I stood at the head of the long glass table and projected the initial Experian reports onto the main screen. This is not a corporate client, I told my team, keeping my voice perfectly level. This is a personal matter, but we will treat it with the exact same clinical precision we apply to a Fortune 500 embezzlement case. My identity was compromised to the tune of $150,000. The targets are Richard Wilson and Kelsey Prescott. I want every single digital footprint they left behind isolated and documented. Marcus did not waste a second. He immediately began pulling the IP logs tied to the fraudulent credit applications. Within 2 hours, he had successfully traced every single submission. They had not even tried to cover their tracks properly. Every application had been pinged directly from the router of the Connecticut rental house. Furthermore, Marcus found that the secondary verification emails were routed to a newly created account that Kelsey had registered using her own backup phone number. They handed us a fully wrapped conviction, Marcus said, shaking his head in disbelief as he highlighted the matching IP addresses. It is almost insulting how sloppy this is. They did not use a VPN. They did not bounce the signal. They literally sat in their living room and committed federal crimes on an open network. While Marcus secured the digital trail, Sarah and David were dissecting the cash flow. They pulled the merchant codes from the fraudulent credit cards. It was a sickening display of pure, unadulterated vanity. Kelsey had not just paid the wedding venue. She had treated my stolen credit line like a blank check for her new billionaire lifestyle. Sarah projected a spreadsheet detailing the expenditures. There was a $20,000 charge at a custom bridal boutique in Milan. There was a $15,000 invoice for private jet charters to the Caribbean. There were dozens of smaller transactions ranging from $500 to $2,000 at luxury spas, premium jewelers, and high-end cosmetic surgeons. Every single charge was a desperate attempt to prove she belonged in the Prescott family orbit. But the most devastating piece of evidence was the collateral document. David had managed to pull the complete routing history of the Prescott Company stock transfer. Cameron Prescott had executed the transfer of the voting shares to Kelsey 3 weeks before the wedding. He had used a secondary holding account to bypass his father's primary trust overseers. Kelsey had then taken those exact shares and listed them as liquid assets to secure the massive credit limits under my name. She tied the Prescott corporate equity directly to the fraudulent accounts, David explained, pointing to the overlapping dates on the timeline. If the banks realize the guarantor collateral is tied to a stolen identity, they are legally obligated to freeze the shares. Arthur Prescott was not bluffing about his panic yesterday. If this goes public, the SEC will be all over his company for allowing restricted voting shares to be used in a wire fraud scheme. I nodded, absorbing the data. The trap was perfectly set. The evidence was bulletproof. I was just about to instruct Marcus to compile the final package for the federal authorities when my office assistant knocked on the glass door. She stepped into the war room carrying a thick certified mail envelope. It had just been delivered via priority courier. I took the envelope and sliced it open. I pulled out a heavy piece of legal stationery bearing the letterhead of a law firm located in a strip mall in upstate New York. I read the name at the top. It was from a man named Thomas Vance, claiming to represent Richard and Helen Wilson. I read the contents of the letter aloud to my team. It was a masterpiece of desperate intimidation. This Vance character stated that he had been retained by my parents to address my malicious and unfounded attempts to extort them. The letter explicitly threatened to file a massive civil lawsuit against me for defamation of character and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It claimed that I had voluntarily agreed to finance the wedding and that I was now fabricating a story of identity theft out of pure jealousy regarding my sister's prominent marriage. The final paragraph was the absolute climax of their delusion. Thomas Vance formally demanded that I cease all contact with the Prescott family immediately. Furthermore, he demanded that I assume full and permanent financial responsibility for the $150,000 in credit debt. If I did not sign a written admission of my financial liability within 48 hours, he would file the defamation suit and seek to have my professional licenses revoked. A heavy silence fell over the war room. David let out a low whistle. Sarah looked completely baffled. Are they actually serious? Sarah asked, staring at the letter in my hands. They committed easily provable federal wire fraud, and their response is to send a cease and desist letter demanding you pay the bill. I looked down at the cheap legal stationery. It was not a real threat. It was a panic response. Richard had realized that Arthur Prescott was not going to save him. He realized that the billionaire was furious about the compromised stock shares. So Richard had scrambled. He had found the cheapest, most aggressive bulldog lawyer he could afford and paid him to draft a terrifying letter, hoping I would simply fold under the pressure of a lawsuit. He was playing a game of chicken with a freight train. This is not a legal strategy, I told my team, dropping the letter onto the glass table next to the mountain of undeniable forensic evidence. This is a bluff from a desperate man who knows he is drowning. He thinks he can scare me into paying his debts so he can keep playing pretend. I looked at the digital displays showing the IP logs, the luxury expenditures, and the illegal stock transfer routing numbers. My parents had decided to double down on their lies. They had decided to threaten my career to protect their fraudulent crimes. They had officially crossed the point of no return. Marcus, I said, my voice completely devoid of any hesitation. Ignore the 48-hour deadline in that letter. Compile the entire forensic package right now. Include the IP traces, the stock transfer documents, and every single fraudulent receipt. What are we doing with it? Marcus asked, his fingers already flying across his keyboard. We are not sending it to the police just yet, I replied, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. We are going to send a copy to Arthur Prescott's primary corporate counsel. If Richard wants to play with lawyers, we are going to let the Prescott legal team tear him to absolute shreds before the feds even arrive. Marcus did not hesitate. His fingers hammered across the mechanical keyboard with brutal efficiency. Within 90 seconds, the encrypted dossier containing every piece of evidence was sealed and sent directly to the private email server of Arthur Prescott's chief legal counsel. The trap was sprung, but I was not finished. The adrenaline was running cold and sharp through my veins. Leave the credit card fraud on the secondary monitors, I commanded, stepping closer to the main digital display. Richard is an arrogant man, but he is also a coward. People do not suddenly pivot to massive federal identity theft unless they are trying to cover up a much older, much deeper financial sinkhole. If he was desperate enough to steal my social security number to appease the Prescotts, he has been hiding something else. Sarah, I want you to tear apart his historical cash flow. Go back 5 years. Cross-reference his reported corporate salary with his actual asset liquidity. Sarah nodded, her eyes locked on her screen. She began pulling property records, vehicle leases, and publicly available tax liens. David stood beside her, mapping out the discrepancies on the digital whiteboard. For 10 minutes, the war room was entirely silent, except for the rapid clicking of keyboards and the hum of the servers. Then Sarah stopped typing. She leaned forward, squinting at a string of alphanumeric routing codes. Jocelyn, you need to see this, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a serious clinical register. I traced the initial seed money Richard used to pay the activation fees on those fraudulent credit accounts. It did not come from his personal checking account. It was wired from a blind commercial trust. Put it on the main board, I ordered. The screen flashed, shifting from the credit reports to a complex web of corporate registrations. Sarah highlighted a single entity sitting at the very center of the web. It is a shell corporation, Sarah explained, tracing the digital lines with her laser pointer. Registered in Delaware exactly 3 years ago. The entity is called KW Holdings LLC. Delaware has incredibly strict corporate secrecy laws, making it the perfect place to hide ownership. But Richard made a fatal operational error. He used the same IP address from his previous home office to file the annual franchise tax reports. David stepped up, analyzing the inbound and outbound cash flows attached to the shell company. He let out a sharp breath. This is a textbook tax evasion syndicate, David said, pointing to a series of offshore transfers. Richard has been using this Delaware shell to aggressively launder his corporate bonuses and under-the-table consulting fees. He routes the dirty money into KW Holdings, claims it as business losses through fabricated vendor invoices, and completely bypasses the IRS. He has been dodging federal income taxes for 36 months. We are looking at a minimum of $500,000 in unreported income. I stared at the screen, the pieces of my father's desperate facade finally snapping into place. He was not just a terrible father and a credit fraudster. He was a systematic tax cheat. He was bleeding his own income dry to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth and hiding the evidence from the federal government in a phantom company. Pull the original incorporation documents, I told Marcus. Delaware protects the identity of the beneficial owners, but they still require a registered agent and a managing director on the initial filing. Break the firewall. I want to see whose name is on the executive line. Marcus ran a localized decryption script, bypassing the public-facing redactions to access the raw filing data. A scanned PDF of the original incorporation paperwork filled the screen. I looked at the signature line at the bottom of the document. My blood ran completely cold. It was not Richard's signature. The registered managing director, the sole legal owner of KW Holdings LLC, the person entirely responsible for 3 years of federal tax evasion and money laundering, was Kelsey Wilson. I used her, Sarah whispered, genuine horror creeping into her voice. He did not put his own name on the shell company. He made his favorite daughter the fall guy. If the IRS ever audited this account, Richard would walk away clean. Kelsey is the one holding the bag for $500,000 in unpaid federal taxes. I stood paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of Richard's betrayal. My entire life he had treated Kelsey like a fragile princess. He had given her everything, ignored my existence to cater to her every whim and defended her worst behavior. He claimed she was the golden child. But in the dark reality of his financial crimes, she was nothing but a human shield. He loved her vanity, but he loved his own freedom more. He had set her up to take the fall for a federal prison sentence. Pull up her social media, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. David grabbed his tablet and mirrored Kelsey's public Instagram account to the screen, right next to her fraudulent federal tax documents. The contrast was absolutely sickening. On the left side of the screen was the undeniable proof that Kelsey was the CEO of a criminal money laundering enterprise, facing years in federal prison and catastrophic IRS penalties. On the right side of the screen was her latest story, posted less than 20 minutes ago. She was lounging on the deck of a private yacht in the Maldives. She was holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne, wearing a silk cover-up that cost more than a mortgage payment. The caption read, "Living my best billionaire life, with my perfect husband, blessed beyond measure." She was smiling at the camera, completely oblivious. She had absolutely no idea that her father had forged her signature to build a tax evasion empire. She had no idea that the money funding her designer bags and luxury aesthetic was stolen from the IRS. She thought she was a high society princess, untouchable and elite. She was actually a walking federal indictment. She does not know, David said, shaking his head as he watched her clink glasses with Cameron Prescott on the video. She is too stupid to understand corporate finance. Richard probably handed her a stack of papers 3 years ago, told her it was a trust fund document, and she signed it without reading a single word. She is entirely clueless. Richard threw me to the wolves to pay for the wedding, I said. My eyes locked on the dual screens. But he threw Kelsey to the federal government to save his own skin. He is willing to let his precious golden child go to prison just so he can keep his country club membership. The encrypted secure phone on the conference table suddenly began to ring. It was a direct line reserved only for priority client communications. Marcus glanced at the caller ID. "It is Arthur Prescott's legal counsel," Marcus said, looking up at me. They read the file. "Answer it," I ordered, taking my seat at the head of the table. "Let us begin the execution." Marcus pressed the speaker button. The voice that filled the room was smooth, polished, and dripping with the kind of expensive authority that usually terrified people. He introduced himself as Sterling Vance, senior litigation partner representing Prescott Industries, and Arthur Prescott personally. He did not start with pleasantries. He started with standard corporate intimidation tactics, demanding we immediately destroy all copies of their proprietary financial data and threatening severe legal retaliation. I leaned into the center of the glass table and cut him off completely. "You are in no position to issue demands, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice slicing through his expensive arrogance. I am not a disgruntled vendor. I am a forensic auditor holding the detonator to a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy that your client's son voluntarily joined. I walked him through the exact timeline of Cameron's illegal stock transfer. I explained how Cameron bypassed the Prescott family trust overseers to hand institutional voting shares to a woman he barely knew. I listened as the aggressive breathing on the other end of the line shifted into a heavy, stunned silence. Then I dropped the absolute anvil. I told him about KW Holdings LLC. I explained that Cameron had tethered the Prescott family corporate equity to a Delaware shell company currently holding $500,000 in laundered money. I told him Kelsey was the sole registered owner of a tax evasion syndicate, and that the Prescott shares were now legally intertwined with an entity under imminent IRS investigation. Sterling Vance stopped breathing entirely. I could practically hear the blood draining from his face all the way from his penthouse office. I was a smart lawyer. He knew exactly what a federal asset seizure would do to the Prescott stock price. I gave him the ultimatum. Arthur Prescott had exactly 24 hours to force his son to file for an immediate annulment based on extreme financial fraud. Furthermore, Arthur was going to take the KW Holdings dossier and hand it directly to the federal authorities himself. He was going to use his own billionaire status and legal army to destroy my father to protect his own company. Sterling did not argue. He did not threaten me again. He simply said the annulment paperwork would be filed by morning and disconnected the line. The Prescotts were officially turning their guns on my family. Sarah and David stared at me in absolute awe. We had just weaponized one of the most powerful families in the state. The legal trap was locked perfectly into place. But Richard and Helen were completely blind to the avalanche heading their way. They were still living in their fantasy world, believing their cheap extortion letter had secured their victory. My personal cell phone buzzed against the glass table, breaking the silence of the war room. The caller ID showed a local number from the Hamptons. I picked it up and put it on speaker. A man with a thick French accent introduced himself as Laurent, the general manager of the ultra-exclusive oceanfront resort where Kelsey's wedding events were currently being hosted. He sounded incredibly nervous and highly apologetic. He stated he needed direct verbal authorization for a massive addition to the existing event contract before his staff could proceed. I asked him what he meant. Laurent hesitated before explaining that my mother Helen had just contacted the resort's private events department an hour ago. She was acting as if she owned the entire eastern seaboard. She demanded to book the resort's grand conservatory for a spectacular post-wedding celebration this upcoming Saturday. She told the staff she wanted to invite all of the Prescott's elite socialite friends and business partners who could not make the destination ceremony. She demanded imported beluga caviar stations. She ordered a live string quartet. She wanted towering ice sculptures and a literal pyramid of vintage champagne. Laurent told me the estimated cost for this spontaneous display of high society wealth was an additional $60,000. And then he delivered the absolute pinnacle of my parents' delusion. Helen had explicitly instructed the resort manager to put the entire charge on the existing credit account under my name. She had actually laughed on the phone and told Laurent that her eldest daughter Jocelyn was absolutely thrilled to sponsor the event as a surprise wedding gift for the happy couple. My parents genuinely believed their fake extortion letter had broken me. They thought I was sitting in my apartment terrified of their strip mall lawyer quietly accepting my fate as their personal financial hostage. They thought they had won. They thought they could just keep swiping the stolen cards to throw a party celebrating their own crimes. Laurent asked if he should immediately decline the booking and flag the account for fraud. I looked up at the digital whiteboard. I looked at the undeniable proof of my father's federal tax evasion and my sister's insatiable greed. I looked at the exact monetary value of the fraud that was about to send them all to prison. A cold, hard smile slowly spread across my face. "Do not cancel anything, Laurent," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "Approve the booking, give them exactly what they asked for, serve them the most expensive items on your menu, and pour the finest champagne you have in the cellar. Do not deny a single request they make." Laurent sounded completely bewildered. He warned me about the staggering final cost of the event and the liability involved. I told him not to worry about the cost. I told him to make sure the ballroom was packed with every single elite guest my mother had invited. I want a place set for me right at the center of the head table. I will be attending that party personally to settle the bill. The drive to the Hamptons gave me exactly 2 hours to finalize my strategy. I did not wear a ball gown. I wore a razor-sharp charcoal Tom Ford suit paired with blood-red stilettos. This was not a social visit. I was an auditor stepping onto an active crime scene, and I dressed for an execution. When I pulled up to the grand conservatory of the oceanfront resort, the sheer audacity of my mother's spending was on full display. Valets were parking Bentleys and Ferraris. I bypassed the greeting line and walked straight through the towering glass doors. Laurent had followed my instructions perfectly. The room was a sickening monument to stolen wealth. A live string quartet played classical music in the corner. Waiters in white gloves circulated with silver trays of beluga caviar and imported truffles. In the center of the room stood a literal pyramid of vintage champagne, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. I stood at the top of the grand staircase and looked down at the parasites feasting on my stolen identity. It took less than 30 seconds for Richard to spot me. He was standing near the ice sculpture holding a highball glass and laughing loudly with a group of Prescott corporate executives. The moment his eyes locked onto mine, the glass nearly slipped from his fingers. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse in a tailored tuxedo. He urgently grabbed Helen by the elbow and pointed in my direction. My mother dropped her polite society smile instantly. Pure panic flashed across her features, followed immediately by desperate anger. They excused themselves from the executives and practically sprinted across the marble floor to intercept me before I could reach the main dining area. "What are you doing here?" Richard hissed, grabbing my forearm and trying to pull me toward a secluded alcove behind a floral arrangement. I yanked my arm out of his grip with a sharp, violent motion. "Do not ever touch me," I said, my voice low enough to avoid a scene but lethal enough to make him step back. Helen stepped forward, her face flushed with fury. "You have absolutely no right to be here, Jocelyn," she whispered harshly, looking around frantically to see if anyone was watching us. "This is an exclusive private event for the Prescott family and their inner circle. You are going to turn around and walk right back out those doors, or I am going to have the resort security throw you out onto the street." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "You are going to call security on the woman who is actively paying for the roof over your head?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "You might want to check the name on the master account holding this reservation, Helen. If security throws anyone out, it will be the people committing federal wire fraud." Richard swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. "You got our lawyer's letter," he stammered, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "You know what happens if you cause a scene here. We will ruin you." Before I could tear his hollow legal threat to shreds, a high-pitched laugh echoed behind them. Kelsey was gliding across the marble floor, her arm linked tightly with Cameron Prescott. She was wearing a custom silk gown that probably cost enough to feed a family for a year. She looked like the absolute picture of a high-society newlywed, radiant, oblivious, and completely intoxicated by her own perceived power. She had noticed the tension and walked over specifically to assert her dominance. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Kelsey said, a cruel, mocking smirk playing on her lips. She looked me up and down, taking in my tailored suit with obvious disdain. "Did you come here to swipe your credit card, big sister? Everyone here is high class, don't embarrass me any further." I stared at her, taking in the sheer magnitude of her ignorance. She had absolutely no idea that her father had forged her signature on a commercial trust. She had no idea she was the sole legal owner of a Delaware shell company, currently harboring $500,000 in laundered money. She thought she had won the lottery. She did not realize she was dancing on top of a federal landmine. "Everyone here is high class," Kelsey continued, her voice dripping with venom. "We have senators, corporate executives, and international investors in this room. You do not belong here, Jocelyn. Just pay the bill and go back to your sad little accounting job." Cameron stood slightly behind her, looking mildly uncomfortable, but he wrapped a protective arm around her waist. "Listen, Jocelyn," he said, trying to sound like a commanding patriarch. "This weekend has been stressful enough. Kelsey is my wife now, and I will not have you harassing her or her family. You need to leave. I shifted my gaze from Kelsey to Cameron. You really are a special kind of fool, Cameron, I said, my voice dropping to a conversational chill. You bypassed your own father's trust overseers to hand institutional voting shares to a woman who cannot even spell fiduciary. You tied your family legacy to a financial sinkhole, and you are standing here trying to act like a protector. Kelsey scoffed, waving her hand in my face. Oh, please stop using big words to sound important. You are just jealous. You have always been jealous of me because Mom and Dad actually love me. They know I deserve the best. That is why they made sure I had the perfect wedding. I looked at Richard. He was staring at the floor, looking like he was about to vomit. He knew exactly what I was looking at. He knew I held the Delaware Incorporation documents. He knew I had the IP traces proving he set up the shell company in Kelsey's name. Helen was oblivious, puffing out her chest to defend her golden child. Kelsey is right, Helen snapped. She married into the Prescott empire. She is a Prescott now. She has secured a future you could never even dream of. You are just a bitter, lonely woman trying to ruin her happiness because you have nothing of your own. I let the silence hang for a moment, letting them wallow in their false superiority. Laurent, the general manager, nervously approached our tense little circle holding a silver tray with a pristine white envelope. He looked at me for permission. I nodded. He cleared his throat and addressed Richard and Helen. Excuse me, sir, Madame Laurent, said, his thick French accent cutting through the tension. Mademoiselle Jocelyn instructed me to present the preliminary invoice for tonight's editions. Richard snatched the envelope from the tray, his hands trembling. He opened it and his eyes widened in sheer terror. The total sat at just over $65,000. Are you going to put that on the card, Dad? Kelsey asked, batting her eyelashes innocently. Or is Jocelyn going to take care of it like a good sister? I smiled. It was a terrifying void of a smile. I am not paying for a single thing tonight, Kelsey, I said, my eyes locking onto hers. But do not worry. Your father has a very special corporate account he uses for high-end expenses. Is that not right, Richard? Tell her about KW Holdings LLC. Tell your new husband about the $500,000 in untaxed income you routed through Delaware over the last 3 years. Richard gasped, taking a physical step backward. Helen looked confused. Kelsey just frowned, annoyed that she did not recognize the company name. What are you talking about? Kelsey demanded. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I am talking about your federal tax evasion syndicate, Kelsey, I whispered softly. I am talking about the fact that your father used your name to open a shell company to hide his stolen money. I am talking about the fact that you are the sole registered owner of a money laundering operation, and the IRS is going to seize every single asset you currently hold, including that shiny new wedding ring. I brushed past her stunned, frozen figure and walked directly toward the main dining floor. I am going to take my seat at the head table now, I called over my shoulder. Enjoy your caviar while you still can. I bypassed the draped chairs and the silver centerpieces entirely. My heels clicked a sharp, steady rhythm against the polished marble as I marched directly toward the elevated stage at the far end of the grand conservatory. The string quartet was halfway through a vibrant Vivaldi piece. The room was a shimmering ocean of silk taffeta and diamonds. The elite of New York high society were laughing and clinking glasses, completely unaware that the floor was about to drop out from under them. I walked up the 3 velvet-lined steps to the stage. The master of ceremonies, a man in a crisp white tuxedo, looked at me in polite confusion as I approached his podium. I did not offer an explanation. I simply reached out and snatched the heavy wireless microphone directly from his grip. My thumb flicked the power switch. The sudden feedback caused a deafening, high-pitched screech to tear through the massive room. The Vivaldi piece stopped mid-note. The laughter died instantly. Hundreds of faces turned toward the stage, their expressions shifting from wealthy amusement to startled annoyance. I stood dead center under the brightest chandelier, holding the microphone with an iron grip. I looked out over the sea of guests and locked eyes with Richard and Helen, who were frozen near the ice sculptures. Welcome, everyone, I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls, cold and amplified. I am Jocelyn. A murmur rippled through the front rows. A few people recognized my name from the peripheral wedding gossip. They thought I was the estranged sister, the bitter relative who was supposed to be hiding in the shadows. I did not give them time to whisper. I stand here to announce exactly what you are celebrating tonight. I continued my tone, carrying the clinical precision of a courtroom prosecutor. I stand here to announce that the vintage champagne you are drinking, the custom silk dress, the bride is wearing, the imported caviar on your plates, everything is a lie. It is entirely paid for by identity theft. It is entirely funded by federal wire fraud committed using my social security number. The room gasped. It was not a polite murmur. It was a collective physical shock. Men in custom suits lowered their glasses. Women covered their mouths. Stolen money paid for the ice sculptures, I said, leaning into the microphone, using the repetition like a hammer striking a nail. Stolen money paid for the valet parking. Stolen money paid for the floral arrangements. Stolen money paid for the illusion that the Wilson family belongs in this room. My parents, Richard and Helen Wilson, along with their daughter Kelsey, stole my identity to secure $150,000 in fraudulent credit to finance this charade. Turn that off, Richard roared. He was charging across the dance floor, his face purple with rage. Turn that microphone off right now. Security, get her out of here. He lunged toward the stage, but two massive men in dark suits stepped seamlessly into his path, blocking him completely. Laurent, the resort manager, had kept his word. I was the name on the master account holding the reservation. I was the client. Richard was just a guest. Richard slammed into the security guards and was shoved forcefully backward onto the marble floor. Helen shrieked, rushing forward to grab her husband's arm. This is a lie, she screamed, hysterically addressing the crowd. She is insane. She is a jealous, pathological liar trying to ruin her sister's perfect day. Do not listen to her. Kelsey stepped out from the crowd, her face twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic fury. She had let go of Cameron's arm and marched to the edge of the stage. Did you come here to swipe your credit card, big sister? Kelsey sneered, her voice dripping with venomous mockery. Everyone here is high class, don't embarrass me any further. You are pathetic, Jocelyn. You show up here making up insane stories because you cannot stand the fact that I won. I am a Prescott now. I am untouchable. You are just a sad auditor. I looked down at her. She was so blinded by her own vanity that she could not see the guillotine hanging directly over her neck. You are an auditor, Kelsey, I replied, my voice projecting clearly over the speakers for every single guest to hear. You just do not know it yet. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the credit card fraud is just the appetizer. The main course is much worse. I looked past Kelsey and locked eyes with a group of older men standing near the bar. They were the Prescott corporate executives. I needed them to hear every single syllable. 3 years ago, Richard Wilson realized he could not afford his country club lifestyle on his corporate salary, I announced, pacing slowly across the stage. So he set up a Delaware shell company called KW Holdings LLC. He used this phantom company to launder his bonuses and evade federal income taxes. He has successfully hidden $500,000 from the IRS. Richard stopped struggling against the security guards. He froze completely, the fight draining out of his body as the name of his secret shell company echoed through the grand conservatory. But Richard is a coward, I continued, my voice rising with lethal authority. He did not put his own name on the incorporation documents. He forged the signature of his favorite daughter. Kelsey Wilson is the sole registered managing director of a federal tax evasion syndicate. And just 3 weeks ago, she used Cameron Prescott's illegally transferred corporate voting shares to collateralize her fraudulent credit lines. The reaction from the Prescott executives was immediate and violent. 3 of the older men slammed their champagne glasses onto the nearest table and began marching directly toward Cameron. The word SEC rippled through the crowd like wildfire. High society operates on a strict code of self-preservation. The moment a financial plague is announced, the rats flee the ship. That is a lie, Kelsey shrieked, her voice breaking into a panicked pitch. Daddy, tell them it is a lie. I do not own a company. I do not know anything about taxes. Cameron, tell them to stop looking at me like that. She turned to grab her new husband, but Cameron was already taking a step backward. His face was gray. He was looking at his corporate mentors who were glaring at him with absolute murderous intent. Cameron realized in that exact second that he had dragged his father's billionaire empire into a money laundering investigation. "Cameron, do something," Kelsey sobbed, reaching for his jacket. "Do not touch me," Cameron hissed, slapping her hand away violently. "You used my family's stock to commit federal fraud. You lied to me." "I did not lie," she wailed, spinning back to look at her father. "Dad, tell him." Richard could not speak. He was staring at the floor, his chest heaving, his entire world reduced to ash. Helen was weeping openly, clutching her designer dress, as the elite guests literally began backing away from them, forming a wide circle of isolation around the Wilson family. I stepped down from the stage, walking slowly down the velvet steps. The crowd parted for me, parting like the Red Sea, allowing me a clear path straight to my sister. "You wanted to live a billionaire lifestyle, Kelsey," I said, stopping inches from her tear-streaked face. "You wanted to be surrounded by high-class people. Take a good look around." I gestured to the room. The guests were leaving. They were setting down their plates, dropping their napkins, and heading straight for the exit doors. Nobody wanted to be photographed at a party funded by wire fraud. Nobody wanted to be subpoenaed by the IRS because they ate stolen caviar. The Grand Conservatory was emptying out in a mass exodus of silk and tuxedos. "They are not your friends, Kelsey," I whispered, stepping even closer, so only she could hear the final devastating truth. "They are witnesses. And when the federal agents raid this resort tomorrow morning to seize the receipts, you will finally understand exactly what it means to be the CEO of your father's crimes." The echo of my voice had barely faded before the physical reality of my words snapped my father's remaining sanity. The carefully curated mask of Richard Wilson, the successful patriarch, shattered into a million jagged pieces. He let out a guttural, animalistic roar that tore through the sudden silence of the emptying ballroom. "You are insane," he screamed, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. "Turn that microphone off right now." He charged at me with the speed I did not know he still possessed. His arm drew back, his hand raised in a tight, flat palm aimed directly at my face. He fully intended to strike me down right there on the marble floor, to physically beat me into submission, the way he had always verbally beaten me down growing up. He wanted to silence the ugly truth with sheer brute force. I did not flinch. I did not step back. Before his hand could make contact, the two private security guards Laurent had assigned to me intercepted his path. One guard grabbed Richard's raised wrist, twisting it sharply downward, while the other drove a heavy shoulder into his chest. Richard slammed backward, crashing hard against the edge of the head table. Crystal glasses shattered, raining expensive champagne over his tailored tuxedo. "Get your hands off him!" Helen shrieked, rushing forward to claw at the security guard's broad shoulders. "She is a liar. My daughter is a pathological liar. She fabricated this entire delusion because she is a bitter spinster who wants to destroy her sister's special day." I stood over them, looking down at the pathetic display. "You still think this is about jealousy, Helen?" I asked, my voice echoing off the vaulted glass ceilings. "You think I spent months tracking offshore bank accounts, unraveling shell companies, and cooperating with federal investigators because I care about Kelsey's wedding dress?" Kelsey finally broke out of her paralyzed state. She stumbled forward, her silk gown catching on the broken glass. She ignored me entirely and grabbed her father by the lapels of his soaked jacket. "Dad, tell me she is lying." Kelsey sobbed, her voice cracking with pure terror. "Tell me you did not put my name on a fake company. Tell me the IRS is not going to take my ring. Cameron is leaving. His father's lawyers are already calling him. Fix this right now." Richard could not look at her. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, gasping for breath against the side of the table. His silence was the loudest confession in the room. "He cannot fix this, Kelsey," I said, stepping off the lowest stair and walking toward her. "He forged your signature on the incorporation documents, but you signed the credit applications for this party. You happily swiped the cards he gave you. You bragged about your unlimited budget. Ignorance of the law is not a defense when your name is on the fraudulent accounts." Cameron Prescott emerged from the shrinking crowd holding his cell phone. His face was a mask of cold corporate detachment. He looked at Kelsey not with the love of a new husband, but with the calculating disgust of a liability assessment. "My family's legal team has advised me to leave the premises immediately." Cameron stated, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "We are filing for an emergency annulment first thing Monday morning. You will not contact me. You will not contact my family. If you or your parents attempt to approach Prescott Industries, our security will have you arrested for trespassing. Cameron, please, Kelsey begged, reaching out to grab his sleeve. You cannot just leave me. We just got married. I did not know what my father was doing. I am innocent. You are a radioactive asset, Kelsey Cameron replied coldly, pulling his arm away so forcefully she stumbled. And I do not retain radioactive assets. He turned his back on her and walked out the side exit surrounded by his remaining executives. He did not look back once. Kelsey dropped to her knees on the marble floor, sobbing hysterically into her hands. The golden child was finally experiencing the consequences of the pedestal our parents had built for her. Helen dropped to the floor beside her, wrapping her arms around Kelsey and glaring up at me with absolute venom. Are you happy now, Jocelyn? She spat, her makeup running down her face. You ruined your sister's life. You destroyed your own family. We are going to sue you for defamation. We will take everything you have for doing this to us. I looked at the woman who had spent 35 years making me feel completely invisible. I looked at the father who had literally stolen my identity to fund his criminal ego. You have already taken everything you could from me. Helen, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm register. You took my credit. You took my peace of mind. You took every ounce of familial trust I ever possessed. But you made one fatal miscalculation. You underestimated my ability to fight back and secure my own financial independence. Richard finally found his voice. He pushed himself up from the table, leaning heavily against the wood. You have no proof, he wheezed, glaring at me with bloodshot eyes. You have a bunch of wild accusations and a microphone. Nobody is going to believe a bitter accountant over a respected executive. The feds are not going to care about some petty family dispute. I tilted my head, checking the face of my watch. It was exactly 8:15. You are right about one thing, Richard, I said, taking a slow, deliberate step backward. I told you the federal agents would raid this resort tomorrow morning. That was a lie. I gave them the exact timeline of this reception. I told them precisely when all the key players in KW Holdings LLC would be gathered in one highly localized, completely contained space. Richard froze. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him deathly pale. His eyes darted toward the main lobby. I did not come here to ruin a wedding, I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. I came here to ensure you did not leave the building. Before Richard could even process the words, a heavy mechanical thud echoed through the grand conservatory. The massive double doors at the main entrance did not just open. They were shoved apart with violent, synchronized force. A squad of men and women wearing tactical windbreakers flooded into the room. The bright yellow letters FBI were emblazoned across their backs and chests. Federal police officers followed immediately behind them, moving with swift tactical precision to block the main exit, the side doors, and the kitchen corridors. Nobody move, a commanding voice shouted over the remaining crowd. The lead agent, a tall man with steel gray hair, marched directly onto the dance floor. He raised his badge high above his head, the gold shield catching the light of the chandeliers. FBI Financial Crimes Division, the agent announced, his voice echoing off the glass walls. We have federal arrest warrants for Richard Wilson and Kelsey Wilson for wire fraud, tax evasion, and identity theft. Keep your hands where we can see them. The lead agent did not wait for Richard to comply. He signaled with a sharp nod, and 4 heavily armed agents moved precisely through the wreckage of the shattered champagne glasses. They bypassed the stunned socialites and the terrified resort staff, zeroing in directly on my parents. Richard raised his hands, palms facing outward, in a frantic gesture of surrender. His previously immaculate tuxedo was stained with alcohol, and his face was slick with sweat. He tried to summon his deep corporate voice, the one he used to intimidate boardrooms and silence his family. Listen to me, Richard stammered, taking a step backward as an agent grabbed his shoulder. There is a massive misunderstanding here. I am the Senior Vice President of Operations for Regional Manufacturing. You cannot just storm into a private reception. Let me call my legal team. We can clear this up in a conference room. The lead agent did not even blink. He pulled a folded document from his tactical vest and held it up for the entire ballroom to see. Richard Vance Wilson, he stated, his voice cutting through the silent room with absolute authority. We have a federal warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of money laundering, and 1 count of aggravated identity theft. You do not understand, Richard pleaded, his voice cracking as an agent forcefully pulled his arms behind his back. My daughter is confused. She is having a mental breakdown. This is a family dispute over a credit card. It is a civil matter. Federal crimes are not civil matters, Mr. Wilson, the agent replied coldly. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around Richard's wrists echoed through the grand conservatory like a gunshot. It was the undeniable sound of a dynasty collapsing. The resort guests, the senators, the executives, and the socialites collectively gasped. Some raised their phones to record the spectacle. The man who had spent his entire life obsessing over high society optics was now being paraded as a common criminal in front of the very people he worshipped. 2 other agents converged on Helen. My mother had been standing completely frozen, staring at Richard's constrained hands, as if her brain could not process the visual information. When a female agent reached out and firmly grasped her wrist, the illusion finally shattered. No, Helen shrieked violently, jerking her arm away. Do not touch me. I have done nothing wrong. I am the mother of the bride. You are ruining the wedding. Ma'am, you are also named on the warrant, the agent warned, tightening her grip and forcing her arm behind her back. Cooperate or we will charge you with resisting arrest. As the cold steel clamped down around her wrists, Helen's knees buckled. Her designer heels slipped on the spilled champagne, and she collapsed onto the hard marble floor. The sheer physical reality of the handcuffs broke whatever delusion she was still clinging to. Her pristine socialite facade melted away, leaving behind a terrified, desperate woman. She looked up at the stage, her eyes locking onto mine with frantic, wild desperation. Jocelyn, she screamed, sobbing hysterically as the agents tried to pull her back to her feet. Jocelyn, please, tell them to stop. Tell them it was a mistake. I stood at the edge of the stage looking down at her. I did not move a single muscle. I watched the woman who had spent my entire life treating me like an inconvenient shadow suddenly realize I held her entire future in the palm of my hand. We are your parents, Helen wailed, her voice echoing painfully off the glass walls. We gave you a home, we raised you. You cannot send your own mother to prison over a piece of plastic. Just tell them you authorized the credit applications. Tell them you gave us permission to use your social security number. If you withdraw the complaint, they will let us go. Jocelyn, please, I am begging you. Her pleas were entirely transactional. Even now, kneeling in spilled liquor wearing handcuffs, she was not apologizing for destroying my life. She was demanding that I sacrifice myself to save hers. She wanted me to lie to federal agents to become an accomplice to her crimes, just to preserve her comfortable suburban existence. She wanted me to fall on my sword, so she could keep wearing her stolen pearls. I looked past her to Richard, who was staring at me with a pathetic, silent plea in his eyes. Then I looked at Kelsey, who was being detained by another agent, sobbing uncontrollably as she was informed of her rights regarding the Delaware Shell Company. They were all going down together. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, staring down at the woman who had called me a failure and a disappointment for 35 years. I cannot drop the charges. Helen, I said, my voice carrying a lethal calm that sliced through her hysterical sobbing. You do not seem to understand how the law works. I did not arrest you. The United States government arrested you. When you bypass a credit lock and forge financial documents using stolen credentials, you commit a federal offense against the state. Helen shook her head wildly, her carefully styled hair falling into her tear-streaked face. But you can fix it, she cried out. You are an auditor. You know how to fix these things. You can fix the numbers. I am an auditor. I agreed, my tone dropping to a chillingly flat register. An identity theft in my field is a federal prison sentence. You can take your time explaining it to the judge. You stole the one thing I needed to survive, and you used it to buy ice sculptures and caviar. I continued, refusing to break eye contact. You jeopardized my professional license, my livelihood, and my freedom, so you could throw a party to impress people who are currently trying to figure out how fast they can run away from you. I looked at the federal agents who were waiting patiently for me to finish. You can stop begging, Helen, I said, turning my back on her and walking slowly across the stage. There is absolutely nothing left to discuss. No, Jocelyn, come back. Helen screamed, thrashing against the agents holding her arms. You cannot do this to us. We are your family. The lead agent signaled his team. Let us move out, he commanded. The agents hauled Richard and Helen toward the main exit. Richard stumbled, his head hung in absolute defeat, his expensive suit ruined. Helen continued to sob and scream my name, her voice growing increasingly hoarse as they dragged her past the horrified wealthy guests who were actively stepping backward to avoid being associated with her. Kelsey followed closely behind them, crying hysterically as an agent guided her forward by the elbow. I stood on the stage and watched the three of them being marched out through the towering glass doors. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles parked outside bathed the dark resort lobby in a harsh, unforgiving glow. The doors swung shut behind them, cutting off my mother's final desperate wail. The silence that fell over the grand conservatory was absolute. I turned to the remaining guests. They were staring at me with a mixture of shock, awe, and sheer terror. I did not offer them an apology or an explanation. I simply walked down the stage stairs, retrieved my purse from a nearby table, and walked out of the ballroom, leaving the false elite to deal with the wreckage of their ruined evening. My debt was finally settled. The lead agent's command hung in the air, freezing the remaining guests in place. For a split second, the grand conservatory was as silent as a tomb. Then the tactical team moved. They operated with a terrifying synchronized efficiency that completely shattered the high society illusion my parents had desperately tried to build. Two agents flanked Richard immediately. He did not have the chance to lower his hands or utter another empty corporate threat. An agent grabbed his right wrist, twisting it sharply behind his back, while shoving him forward against the edge of the nearest catering table. The crystal plates rattled. Richard let out a pathetic gasp as his face was pressed into the white linen tablecloth right next to a spilled tray of imported beluga caviar. You are making a mistake, Richard stammered, his voice muffled against the fabric. I am a senior vice president. I have lawyers. I demand to speak to Sterling Vance. You can speak to anyone you want, after processing the agent, replied his voice completely devoid of emotion. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around Richard's wrists echoed through the cavernous room. It was a beautiful, definitive sound. The heavy steel locking into place was the final period at the end of his decades-long reign of manipulation. The man who had spent his entire life obsessing over appearances, who had belittled me for not fitting into his perfect country club aesthetic, was now being publicly restrained like a common thug. Across the room, two female agents approached Kelsey. My sister was still staring at the exit where Cameron had disappeared, her mind completely unable to process the total collapse of her fairy tale. When the agents took hold of her arms, she snapped back to reality with a violent, hysterical shriek. Get your hands off me, Kelsey screamed, thrashing wildly. Her custom silk wedding gown tore as she kicked out her stilettos, slipping on the puddle of vintage champagne that coated the marble floor. Do not touch me. I am Kelsey Prescott. I am the bride. You cannot arrest me at my own wedding reception. Kelsey Wilson, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud and tax evasion, the agent stated calmly, maintaining an iron grip on her bicep. Stop resisting, or we will add assaulting a federal officer to your charges. Kelsey fought them with the frantic desperation of a spoiled child who had never been told no. She twisted and pulled, sobbing uncontrollably, but the agents expertly swept her legs out from under her. She collapsed hard onto the wet floor, her pristine white dress soaking up the spilled red wine and champagne. The agents pinned her arms behind her back and secured the handcuffs. The golden child was pinned to the ground, weeping into a puddle of alcohol, her diamond tiara knocked crooked. Helen watched the scene unfold with wide, unblinking eyes. Her husband was in custody. Her favorite daughter was pinned to the floor in handcuffs. The illusion was dead. The reality of federal prison was staring her right in the face. Helen's knees finally gave out. She dropped to the floor, her designer dress pooling around her. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the broken glass that tore into her palms. She moved toward the edge of the stage where I stood, looking up at me, with a face entirely contorted by panic. Jocelyn, she wailed, her voice breaking into a guttural sob. Jocelyn, please, you have to stop them. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. We are your family. We gave you everything. You cannot let them take your father and your sister away in handcuffs. I am begging you." I looked down at her. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, hard satisfaction of a balanced ledger. "You did not give me everything, Helen," I replied, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "You took everything from me. You stole my identity to fund your pathetic, desperate need for social validation. You forged my name to buy ice sculptures and caviar. You treated me like a disposable asset for my entire life, and then you literally robbed me to pay for a wedding that was built on a foundation of lies." "Please, Jocelyn," Helen sobbed, reaching up to grab the hem of my trousers. Her hands were smeared with blood from the broken glass. "We will pay it back. We will sell the house. We will do whatever you want. Just withdraw the complaint." I stepped back, pulling my fabric out of her grasp. "Stealing my identity to secure fraudulent credit is not a family dispute," I said, my tone lethal and flat. "Identity theft in my profession is an automatic federal prison sentence. You jeopardized my license, my livelihood, and my freedom just so you could pretend you were wealthy. I am not withdrawing anything. You can take your time explaining your financial strategies to the judge." Before Helen could let out another wail, a new voice thundered through the room. Arthur Prescott, patriarch of the Prescott Empire, stepped out from the shadows near the bar. He had watched his son Cameron walk away, and now he was stepping forward to survey the wreckage. He looked like a storm cloud ready to unleash absolute devastation. He ignored the federal agents and marched directly toward Richard, who was being hauled up from the table by the FBI. Arthur stopped inches from Richard's face. The billionaire's eyes were practically glowing with unchecked fury. "You brought federal agents into a room full of my investors," Arthur snarled, his voice vibrating with rage. "You used my son. You used my company's stock to collateralize a money laundering operation. You tied the Prescott name to a federal crime scene." "Arthur, I did not mean to." Richard gasped, his face slick with sweat. "The market shifted. I needed liquidity. It was a temporary bridge loan. I was going to replace the funds before the audit." "You are a parasite," Arthur interrupted, cutting him off completely. "You are a cheap, desperate fraud. I am going to have my legal team completely obliterate you. By the time my lawyers are finished tearing apart your personal assets, you will not be able to afford a cardboard box, let alone a defense attorney. You are dead to the corporate world, Wilson. You are dead." Arthur turned his attention to Kelsey, who was being pulled to her feet by the female agents. Her dress was a ruined, stained mess, and her makeup was completely smeared down her cheeks. "Mr. Prescott," Kelsey sobbed desperately, trying to step toward him. "Please. Cameron left me. You have to tell him to come back. I am his wife. I did not know what my dad was doing. I love Cameron." Arthur looked at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at her as if she were a rat that had crawled out of the sewer and onto his dining table. "My son is filing for an emergency annulment, first thing Monday morning," Arthur stated, his voice dripping with aristocratic contempt. "You were a temporary mistake. You will never speak to him again. You will never use the Prescott name. If you attempt to contact my family from whatever federal facility they lock you in, I will personally ensure your sentence is doubled." Kelsey let out a piercing, agonizing scream as the reality finally crushed her. She thrashed against the agents, kicking her legs and screaming Cameron's name over and over again. The agents did not hesitate. They practically carried her toward the main exit, dragging her backward across the marble floor. Richard was led out right behind her. He kept his head down, staring at his ruined shoes as he was paraded past the whispering, judging eyes of the few elite guests who had stayed to watch the carnage. Helen was left kneeling alone on the floor, sobbing into her bleeding hands. She had no husband to protect her. She had no golden child to parade around. She had absolutely nothing left. I stood on the stage and took a slow, deep breath. The air in the Grand Conservatory suddenly felt clean. I turned and walked down the velvet stairs. The remaining security guards parted for me. I walked straight past Helen without offering her a single glance. I walked past the ice sculptures, past the pyramid of champagne, and out through the massive glass doors. The cool night air hit my face, carrying the scent of the ocean. The driveway was illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles. I watched as Richard and Kelsey were shoved into the back of separate black SUVs. The doors slammed shut. The engines roared to life. I stood on the steps of the resort and watched the vehicles pull away down the long winding driveway, taking my abusers away in chains. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I had a message from Sterling Vance, the Prescott family lawyer. It was short and incredibly precise. The annulment is filed. Arthur Prescott wants to hire you as our chief financial auditor. Name your price. I locked the screen, slipping the phone back into my pocket. I looked out at the dark ocean, a slow, genuine smile finally breaking across my face. The Wilson family was destroyed, but Jocelyn Wilson was just getting started. The lead FBI agent, a man named Harris, walked down the resort steps and approached me as I stood in the cool night air. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles painted his face in sharp alternating colors. I reached into my oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. It contained every single piece of physical evidence required to lock Richard and Kelsey Wilson away for the next 2 decades. I handed the thick file directly to Agent Harris. He weighed it in his hands, looking at me with a mixture of professional respect and quiet astonishment. Inside that envelope are the original incorporation documents for KW Holdings, LLC. I explained, my voice steady and clinical over the hum of the idling police SUVs. You will find the forged signature pages, the routing numbers for the offshore accounts Richard used to hide his corporate bonuses, and the digital logs tracking the IP addresses he used to execute the transfers. I also included the credit applications Kelsey signed to fund this wedding. Every single dollar of fraudulent spending is highlighted, cross-referenced, and indexed. Agent Harris unclasped the envelope and glanced at the top page. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. I had not just handed them a tip, I had handed them a fully prosecuted case wrapped in a neat bow. He looked back up at me and gave a single definitive nod. You just saved our forensic team about 6 months of digging, Ms. Wilson, he said, tucking the envelope securely under his arm. We have teams moving into their primary residence right now to seize the hard drives, but this physical paper trail is exactly what we need to deny them bail. I looked past him toward the grand conservatory. Through the massive glass walls, I could see the transformation of the million-dollar wedding reception into an active federal crime scene. Agents in tactical gear were unfurling bright yellow crime scene tape across the shattered crystal and spilled champagne. The lavish floral centerpieces and the towering ice sculptures were now nothing more than exhibits of gross financial fraud. Every custom silk napkin, every imported caviar blini, every silver fork represented stolen money. The catering staff stood lined up against the far wall, looking completely bewildered as federal investigators began bagging receipts and photographing the opulent displays. The sheer scale of my family's vanity was now fully cataloged as felony evidence. The heavy glass doors of the lobby slid open one final time. 2 federal marshals were escorting Richard and Helen out to the transport vehicles. My mother was completely silent now, her face buried in her chest, her entire body sagging with the gravity of her newly destroyed reality. But Richard was still fighting. Even in handcuffs, even with his tailored tuxedo torn and stained, he refused to surrender his pride. As the marshals dragged him past me down the stone steps, Richard stopped. He planted his feet, forcing the federal officers to halt for a fraction of a second. He turned his head and locked his bloodshot, furious eyes onto mine. The flashing police lights cast harsh shadows across his face, making him look like a trapped feral animal. You will destroy this family, Richard hissed, the venom in his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated hatred. You are a traitor, Jocelyn. You will burn in hell for doing this to your own blood. I did not step back. I did not break eye contact. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life measuring my worth against his twisted standards of success. I looked at the man who had gladly sacrificed my financial future to protect his own ego. I felt no fear. The little girl who used to crave his validation was completely dead, and the woman standing in her place was untouchable. This family destroyed itself the moment you forged my name, I replied, my voice echoing with absolute freezing finality. I am just the auditor who balanced the books. Richard's jaw clamped shut. He had no rebuttal. He had no more lies to spin. The federal marshal shoved him firmly between the shoulder blades, forcing him forward and pushing him roughly into the back of the armored SUV. Helen was loaded into the vehicle right behind him. The heavy metal doors slammed shut with a resounding, echoing thud, sealing them inside their new reality. Kelsey was already secured in the vehicle ahead of them. Her diamond tiara confiscated, her weeping face pressed against the reinforced glass window as she watched her billionaire fantasy drive away without her. Agent Harris touched the brim of his cap in a silent farewell before turning and walking toward the lead vehicle. The engines revved in unison. One by one, the black federal SUVs pulled away from the grand entrance of the resort. I stood alone on the stone steps, watching them drive down the winding palm-lined avenue. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the manicured lawns and the dark ocean beyond, painting the entire resort in the colors of justice. The sirens wailed a piercing siren song that signaled the absolute end of the Wilson family dynasty. The cars turned onto the main highway and slowly faded into the darkness, taking the toxic weight of my past away with them. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, salty air. The crushing, suffocating pressure that I had carried in my chest for my entire life was completely gone. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the forgotten sister or the disappointment. I was the architect of my own justice. I turned away from the empty driveway and began walking toward my own car parked near the valet. The night was quiet now. The billion-dollar Prescott empire was waiting for my answer, and I had a brand new life to begin. 2 weeks later, the absolute magnitude of that destruction was a matter of public record. The federal government does not operate with empathy. It operates with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. By the Tuesday following the disastrous wedding reception, the Internal Revenue Service had initiated a total asset freeze on Richard and Helen Wilson. Every single checking account, every mutual fund, every hidden offshore holding that I had meticulously mapped out in my report was completely locked down. They could not buy a cup of coffee without federal oversight. The beautiful suburban mansion they had paraded around in the house where they had made me feel like an unwelcome guest for my entire life was a house of cards. They did not even own it. It was leased. When the wire fraud and money laundering charges hit the local news, the property management company invoked a morality clause and terminated their contract immediately. Federal agents had already arrived at the property to seize the leased Mercedes and the luxury SUV directly from the pristine driveway. Richard was denied bail. The judge deemed him a significant flight risk due to his intimate knowledge of offshore corporate accounts and the Delaware shell companies he had established. The man who had obsessed over bespoke suits and country club memberships was now sitting in a concrete federal holding facility wearing an orange jumpsuit. He had zero access to his wealth and zero control over his narrative. Helen was released on a minimal bond, but she had absolutely nowhere to go. The high society friends who used to drink her expensive wine and attend her lavish dinner parties suddenly developed severe amnesia regarding her existence. High society is notoriously allergic to federal indictments. When Helen tried to call her country club acquaintances for a place to stay, her calls went straight to voicemail. The woman who prized social status above her own daughter was forced to move into a cheap, dingy motel on the outskirts of the city, paying day by day with whatever loose cash the feds had not tagged as physical evidence. But the most spectacular collapse belonged to Kelsey. The Prescott family operated like a ruthless military unit. The annulment was brutally swift. Cameron's high-powered legal team completely erased Kelsey from his life as if she had never existed. They froze her out entirely, ensuring she walked away from the brief marriage with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back and the monumental pile of fraudulent debt she had signed her name to. Because Richard had used her as the registered managing director of the fake LLC, the financial liability for the wedding rested squarely on her shoulders. She was legally responsible for over $150,000 in debt for a party that had ended in her own arrest. The federal judge considered her a severe flight risk, given her direct ties to the offshore accounts. Her passport was confiscated immediately. She was legally trapped inside the state, stripped of her designer wardrobe and facing decades in federal prison. To avoid waiting out her trial in a county jail, she had to prove to the court that she maintained lawful employment to pay her court-appointed lawyer fees. No corporate office would touch her. No high-end retail boutique would hire a woman publicly indicted for aggravated identity theft and credit fraud. So the former golden child who had demanded silk-imported caviar and absolute adoration was forced to put on a stiff polyester uniform. She took the only job that would accept a pending felon. She became a cashier at a greasy 24-hour fast food franchise just off the interstate. I decided to verify this reality for myself. I drove my modest sedan to the interstate exit and parked in the lot of the brightly lit burger joint. The air outside smelled heavily of fried oil and exhaust fumes. I walked through the glass doors, my heels clicking against the sticky linoleum floor. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a harsh, unforgiving glare. There she was. Kelsey Wilson stood behind the plastic counter wearing a hideous bright red polo shirt and a matching visor that pushed her unwashed hair flat against her forehead. Her hands, which used to display a massive diamond ring, were now covered in a thin sheen of cooking grease. She looked exhausted, broken, and entirely stripped of her manufactured royalty. I stepped up to the register. Kelsey kept her eyes locked on the digital screen, mindlessly tapping a button. "Welcome to Burger Haven," she mumbled, her voice completely devoid of life. "Can I take your order?" "I will take a black coffee," I replied smoothly. Kelsey froze. Her head snapped up and her eyes widened in absolute horror as she recognized my face. The color completely drained from her cheeks. She looked down at her stained uniform and then back up at my crisp, tailored business suit. "Jocelyn," she whispered, her voice cracking with humiliation. "What are you doing here? Are you here to gloat?" "I am here for a black coffee." "Kelsey," I said, pulling a crisp $5 bill from my wallet and sliding it across the plastic counter. She stared at the money, her hands shaking. "You ruined my life," she hissed, leaning over the register so the manager in the back would not hear. "I have nothing." Cameron blocked my number. "Mom is living in a motel. I have to work double shifts here just to afford a lawyer who tells me I'm going to prison." "You ruined your own life, Kelsey," I replied, my tone completely conversational and devoid of pity. "You stole my social security number. You signed fraudulent credit applications. You chose to fund your luxury lifestyle with federal wire fraud. I simply handed the math over to the people who enforce the law." I picked up my receipt from the counter. "The federal prosecutor called me this morning," I continued, looking directly into her terrified eyes. "They asked if I would be willing to testify at your trial regarding the financial damages I suffered due to your identity theft. I told them I had already cleared my schedule. I will see you in court, Kelsey. Make sure you get my coffee right." I took the hot paper cup from the counter without breaking eye contact. I turned on my heel and walked out of the greasy diner, leaving Kelsey to drown in her own miserable reality. Exactly 48 hours later, I was standing in the soaring glass atrium of the Prescott Global headquarters. The environment was a staggering contrast to the grease-stained linoleum where I had last seen my sister. Here the floors were cut from seamless Italian marble, and the air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and fresh orchids. As the newly appointed chief financial auditor, I commanded an entire floor of analysts and reported directly to Arthur Prescott himself. My calendar was dictated by high-stakes mergers and international compliance laws. The Wilson family drama felt like a distant, irrelevant nightmare. I had just stepped out of a private elevator with two senior vice presidents discussing a corporate acquisition when a sharp, hysterical voice sliced through the hushed professional atmosphere of the lobby. "Jocelyn." The scream was so guttural and raw that several executives stopped in their tracks. I turned slowly. Kelsey was fighting against the grip of a building security officer near the revolving glass doors. She looked entirely unrecognizable. The manicured, polished country club princess was gone. In her place was a frantic, disheveled woman wearing a stained, oversized sweatshirt and cheap canvas sneakers. Her blonde hair, which she used to spend hundreds of dollars maintaining every week, hung in greasy, unkempt strands around her face. Her eyes were bloodshot and swollen from days of crying. When she saw me looking at her, she violently jerked her arm away from the guard and sprinted across the lobby. The two senior vice presidents beside me stepped back in alarm, but I stood perfectly still. I raised a single hand signaling the approaching security team to halt. I wanted everyone in this building to witness the absolute destruction of the golden child. Kelsey did not just approach me. She threw her entire body forward and collapsed onto the hard marble floor directly at my feet. "Please, Jocelyn," she wailed, her voice echoing off the high glass ceilings. "Please, you have to help me. You have to make it stop." I looked down at her. She was literally on her knees weeping onto the toes of my custom leather heels. The sheer pathetic nature of the display elicited absolutely no emotion from me. I clasped my hands in front of me and waited for her to speak. "They took the house!" Kelsey sobbed loudly, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. "The IRS locked everything down. Mom got kicked out of the motel this morning because her debit card declined. She is sleeping in a rental car, Jocelyn, and Dad. They denied his appeal. He is in solitary confinement because he picked a fight with a guard. You have to bail them out." "Bail is not an option for federal financial terrorists," I replied, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet lobby. "And I am certainly not funding Helen's housing arrangements." Kelsey reached out, trying to grab the hem of my tailored trousers, but I took a swift, calculated step backward. She fell forward, catching herself on her hands. "Then just help me," she begged, openly weeping. "I need a loan, Jocelyn. Just a loan. My public defender is an idiot. He says I am going to serve at least 10 years because my name is on the LLC. I owe hundreds of thousands of dollars to the credit card companies. They are garnishing the minimum wage I make at the burger place. I cannot even afford to buy groceries." She looked up at me, her face a mask of total desperation. "You work for Arthur Prescott now!" Kelsey cried out, gesturing wildly at the opulent surroundings. "You make millions. You can afford to give me a loan. Just write me a check so I can hire a real defense attorney. I will pay you back, I swear. I am your sister. You cannot let me go to federal prison." A small, bitter laugh escaped my lips. I looked at the executives and security personnel who had formed a quiet ring around us. Then I looked back down at the weeping wreck on the floor. "You want a loan?" I asked, my tone completely clinical and devoid of any familial warmth. "Let us evaluate you as a financial asset, Kelsey. You have zero collateral. You possess no marketable skills. You are currently indicted on multiple federal counts of wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. You have a mountain of unsecured debt that you accumulated to buy ice sculptures and imported champagne for a wedding to a man who annulled your marriage and erased you from his life." "Please, Jocelyn," she whimpered, pressing her forehead against the cold floor. "I am begging you. From an auditing perspective, lending you a single cent would be gross financial negligence." I continued, ignoring her tears entirely. "Furthermore, you seem to have a severe lapse in memory. The debt you are currently drowning in exists because you stole my identity. You jeopardized my entire livelihood so you could play pretend in a designer dress. You are not a victim, Kelsey. You are a criminal facing the consequences of your own staggering arrogance." Kelsey let out a long, agonizing wail. She slammed her fists against the marble, screaming about how unfair it all was, screaming that I was a monster for watching her drown. She was completely broken, entirely stripped of the unearned superiority she had wielded against me since childhood. I had seen enough. The ledger was officially balanced. I turned my attention to the head of building security, who was standing a few feet away, waiting for my command. I looked at him and delivered my final verdict. "Throw her out," I instructed, my voice echoing with absolute freezing finality. "I do not have a sister. This building only welcomes those with legal identities and clean credit." The security guards did not hesitate. Two heavily built men stepped forward and grabbed Kelsey by her arms, hauling her roughly to her feet. She kicked and thrashed, screaming my name over and over again. Her frantic shrieks bounced off the glass walls as they dragged her backward across the lobby. She fought like a wild animal, but it was completely useless. They hauled her through the revolving doors and tossed her out onto the hard concrete of the city sidewalk. I stood in the center of the lobby and smoothed the front of my jacket. The two vice presidents beside me exchanged a look of profound respect before nodding in my direction. I turned and walked toward the private elevators, ready to get back to work. Outside the glass walls, Kelsey was left sobbing on the pavement, completely alone, entirely bankrupt, and waiting for the federal government to come and lock her away forever. Outside the glass walls, Kelsey was left sobbing on the pavement, completely alone, entirely bankrupt, and waiting for the federal government to come and lock her away forever. I turned away from the spectacle and stepped into the private executive elevator. The heavy brushed steel doors slid shut with a satisfying click, severing the last physical tie I had to the toxic wreckage of my past. The high-speed ascent was completely silent, pulling me up 40 floors above the chaotic streets of the city. I watched the digital floor indicator tick upward, feeling lighter with every passing second. I stepped out onto the top floor where the air was hushed and smelled of expensive mahogany, fresh espresso, and quiet power. My executive assistant, Marcus, was waiting by my desk with a sleek silver tablet in his hand. He wore a crisp, tailored suit and maintained his usual composed demeanor. He did not ask about the commotion downstairs. He simply handed me the tablet with a polite, respectful smile and informed me that my secure private line was ringing. It was a direct call from a restricted number, but Marcus already knew who was on the other end. He nodded once and stepped out of the room, leaving me to my privacy. I walked into my corner office and closed the heavy glass door behind me. The room was expansive, lined with custom-built bookshelves and dominated by a massive polished desk cut from a single piece of dark walnut. I pressed the flashing green button on my console, putting the call on speaker. Arthur Prescott's voice filled the room. It was not the booming, terrifying roar he had used at the wedding reception when he confronted Richard. It was calculated, smooth, and carrying a distinct note of professional reverence. "Jocelyn," he began, his tone measuring every syllable, "I am calling you directly because I believe a situation of this magnitude requires a personal touch. I want to offer you my formal apologies. My son Cameron was foolish enough to bring that parasitic family into our orbit. I was blind to their financial maneuvering, and that oversight nearly cost my empire a significant margin of credibility." I sat back in my leather chair and listened. One of the most powerful billionaires in the country was currently explaining himself to me. "Your forensic audit was nothing short of brilliant," Arthur continued, his voice echoing slightly in the large office. "My legal team spent the entire weekend reviewing the files you handed over to the FBI. They were completely astonished by your precision. You dissected Richard Wilson's offshore accounts with a surgical ruthlessness that I rarely see even in my top-tier executives. You did not just catch a thief, Jocelyn. You completely dismantled him, and you shielded Prescott Global from any residual fallout." "I appreciate the acknowledgement, Mr. Prescott," I replied, my voice perfectly level. The numbers simply told the truth. Richard Wilson built his life on a fraudulent ledger, and he made the fatal mistake of using my name to do it. I only corrected the math and ensured the liability fell exactly where it belonged. Arthur chuckled, a low, appreciative sound that vibrated through the speaker. "You are exactly the kind of predator I need on my side," he stated. "I do not just want you as an independent auditor, Jocelyn. I want to absorb your entire firm. I am offering you an exclusive multi-million-dollar retainer. You will become the primary compliance oversight for all of Prescott Global. You name your price. You name your terms. I want your brain working exclusively for my empire. We will crush anyone who tries to pull a stunt like this again." It was the kind of offer that would make any senior executive drop to their knees in gratitude. It was a golden ticket, a guarantee of generational wealth, and absolute corporate invincibility. Arthur Prescott did not make offers like this twice, and he certainly did not expect anyone to say no. I looked down at the polished surface of my desk. I thought about the little girl who used to beg for scraps of validation from a family that despised her. I thought about how easy it would be to trade one billionaire's shadow for another, to tie my identity to the massive Prescott machine, just as Kelsey had so desperately tried to do. But I had spent my entire life breaking free from chains. I had no intention of putting on a set of golden handcuffs, no matter how heavily encrusted with diamonds they were. "I am incredibly flattered by the offer, Mr. Prescott," I said, keeping my tone perfectly polite and entirely unyielding. However, I must respectfully decline. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Arthur was a man who dictated reality to those around him. He was simply not used to rejection. "Excuse me," he finally said, his voice dropping an octave. "Prescott Global is a phenomenal enterprise," I continued, smoothly, refusing to let his silence intimidate me. "But I built my firm from the ground up on my own terms. I value my independence above any financial retainer. My firm is very selective with our clients, sir. We prefer to maintain a diverse portfolio, rather than tying our resources to a single corporate entity. I will be happy to consult on a case-by-case basis, but my firm remains my own." For a long moment, Arthur did not speak. The quiet stretched out, stretching the tension tight across the room. When he finally did speak, his voice held a mixture of shock and profound, undeniable respect. "You are a very dangerous woman, Jocelyn Wilson," he murmured. "Just Jocelyn," I corrected him smoothly. "The Wilson name died last week. Have a wonderful afternoon, Mr. Prescott." I pressed the button and terminated the call. The silence in my office returned absolute and magnificent. I stood up from my desk and picked up my mug of black coffee. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling window that made up the entire far wall of my office. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant golden hue across the staggering skyline of Manhattan. The towering skyscrapers gleamed like monuments of sheer ambition. Down below, the city was a chaotic grid of yellow cabs and rushing crowds, but up here everything was perfectly still and under my complete control. I pulled my personal phone from my pocket and opened my secure banking application. I navigated to the credit monitoring tab and refreshed the page. The screen loaded instantly, and a bright green circle appeared. My credit score was flawless. The federal investigators had moved swiftly, just as Agent Harris had promised. Every single fraudulent account opened by Helen and Richard had been officially flagged, investigated, and wiped from my history. The massive wedding debts, the fake LLC, the forged signature loans, they were all entirely gone. The legal stain of the family that had tried to destroy me was completely scrubbed clean from the federal database. I owed absolutely nothing to anyone. I took a slow sip of the rich, dark coffee, letting the warmth spread through my chest. I looked out over the glittering city, feeling the true heavy weight of my victory. I did not have a father sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting trial. I did not have a mother weeping in a cheap motel begging for social relevance. I did not have a sister serving fast food in a greasy uniform just to pay off a criminal defense lawyer. I had no family at all, and for the first time in my 35 years on this earth, I felt entirely whole. The slate was clean. The ledger was finally and permanently balanced. My life, my professional identity, and my money belonged entirely and exclusively to me. I stood by the glass, watching the city lights flicker on beneath the darkening sky. It was a sharp, decisive, and brilliant end to a very dark chapter. I was finally completely free. The dramatic collapse of the Wilson family offers a profound lesson about the true nature of loyalty and self-worth. For decades, society has pushed the narrative that blood relations demand unconditional forgiveness and endless sacrifice. Jocelyn completely shatters that myth. The most powerful takeaway from her story is that shared DNA does not grant anyone the right to exploit your life or destroy your future. True empowerment begins the exact moment you stop seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Jocelyn spent her early life as the designated scapegoat, while her parents funded a fraudulent illusion of success for her sister Kelsey. Instead of accepting this assigned role, Jocelyn quietly built her own foundation of undeniable facts and financial independence. When the ultimate betrayal occurred through identity theft, she did not react with a chaotic emotional outburst. She responded with absolute precision. This teaches us that the most effective response to toxic manipulation is not screaming or begging for fairness. It is establishing ironclad boundaries and letting the natural consequences of their actions take full effect. We often trap ourselves in toxic family dynamics because we secretly hope our abusers will eventually see our worth and apologize. Jocelyn realized that her father and sister were entirely incapable of genuine remorse. By handing over the forensic evidence to the federal authorities and stepping into her new role at Prescott Global, she reclaimed her narrative completely. She proved that you do not have to fix a broken family to find your peace. Sometimes the healthiest choice you can make is to balance the ledger, lock the door, and walk into a brilliant future you built entirely with your own two hands. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace, share your survival story in the comments below.